Hey, Mickey.
Hey guys, how's
How are
everyone
you?
doing?
Good,
Good,
good.
good,
You? I'm just
good,
gonna wait
good.
for the rest of our speakers to jump on here, and then I'm just gonna head upstairs at the event that I'm at, so I can get some room. How are you doing? I see Peter here. Maybe I'll add him in too. Maybe. Yeah, it's been interesting. I've been dealing with a lot of challenges on the landlord and tenant board side, not with management of existing properties, but more with transaction. Like I think we're still seeing kind of the tail end of a lot of end users scooping up properties that probably would have once been in the rental housing stock, and a lot of investors sort of exiting the market. And obviously presents challenges for, um, the whatever it is, N11, N12, N13 situation to get vacant possession for a lot of these individuals. And with the backlogs that we're seeing at the landlord and tenant board, um, just wanted to discuss that broadly, obviously, especially getting context from Harry and from Rochelle at Landlord Rescue about what can be done from the landlord perspective, from the tenant perspective, but also from the policy perspective, to kind of make these problems better, right? So I don't know if any of you want to just mention briefly if you're seeing anything in the market, speak anecdotally a bit while we wait for these speakers. I'm just going to send them a link as well. Go ahead, Peter.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, we purchased a property with a tenant, and we're like on pins and needles here because like we're like following up on you know, on a monthly, not even a monthly basis, like twice a month, contingent on vacant possession. And because we know on those back of those forms, on those N12s, you can say if you do not agree with this, and it basically buys the tenant time, right? Where they can fight it even if it is legit. So like we're on pins and needles here because my client's like, I hope this guy moves out, even though we requested vacant possession. Um, it gives us the opportunity to opt out of the deal if he doesn't move out. We wrote that into the clause, but we're finding that concerning. And then like I've got a triplex. I think I sent it to you, listed right now, and like we're not even guaranteeing vacant possession, and it's just because of the shitstorm and of trying to do so, and it's really hurting the listing as well at this point because no one wants to assume tenants that have been there for a decade.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I'm dealing with it on a multiplex right now as well, and then on a couple of others. I mean, I would say it's probably 50-50. Like, there's a lot of ones that don't go perfectly. Rochelle, by the way, I sent you a speaker invite. It is mobile only for Twitter Spaces, just a heads up. But yeah, so I have seen a lot of tenants resisting. Um, Especially showings. Like it usually shows up pretty early, I would say, in the transaction of rental properties, whether or not it's going to be an easy transition. But I think the transaction side, I mean, that sucks kind of for all parties, right? I just want, like, my big curiosity here is what's actually happening with the landlord and tenant board. Like, why are we seeing 8, 10, 12, 16-month delays? Is it bad actors? Is the system actually breaking down, as we've seen suggested in a couple of articles? Like, what's really going on here? Justice, do you have any insight on sort of what's? I know you've commented in quite a few threads about kind of about the landlord and tenant board system creating problems for both tenants and landlords. Do you have any insight sort of on 30,000 feet, like what's going on there?
From what I've heard, it like the government blames it on COVID, and they did have a problem, right? Like where the ministry obviously did get backlogged because of it and don't have enough staff. But I don't know if that's really the only thing that's going on. There was an interesting article that I think Landlord Rescue shared today regarding now like social housing providers complaining about the long wait times. And I found that interesting because in the article it says, oh, it's not only small landlords having this problem. Now it's like the actual social housing. So I'm curious about that, like if that will affect anything. I'm not really sure, but I do know that they dedicated a certain sum of money to get more staff to help, but I'm not sure if anything is going to change. I did actually take over my unit recently, and I had no problem. Like I thought, like from all these horror stories that I've heard, that I might have a problem getting it back. But my tenant actually voluntarily offered to pay market rent for it. Like it was below market rent, and said that, like if it's a financial issue, I'm willing to pay more. But like my reason for taking it back wasn't like purely financial. So I found that interesting. That's all.
Yeah, it
Amazing.
is interesting also, so almost seeing the market innovate a little bit around it. Like I know I've heard of cash for keys, like loan programs coming out to like buy out tenants on like turnovers and stuff like that. I think like a lot of it is like the lingering rents are kind of like, we're looking at an asset market where cap rates are still below capital costs, right? So like if an investor is buying something, they're buying, I mean, in Toronto, probably, I think maybe 4.5, 5, maybe mid 5 cap, you're starting to see. And your financing rates are still higher than that. So like the investments don't make sense. So in order for people, it does require a lot of skilled operation on the handoffs here. And it's a complex problem to solve for both investors and for tenants, right? Peter, I see your hand up there. Do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, briefly. So some anecdotal stuff was, we had actually a couple clients that with their investment properties. Again, they're tenants. They've been there for 5, 6, 7, 10 years, and they know they're paying below market rent, and they're so terrified of like having an N12 stuck in their face, or something along those lines, that they're like, yeah, they're just, I'll pay 4, 5, 600 bucks more a month, just knowing that hopefully it just changes the landlord's mind, right? When they're like willingly offering this money. And then on the cash for keys basis, I just had an agent friend, bought a tenant, basically, using the system to her advantage. And she basically was 8 months behind, and the guy couldn't sell it, so he just offloaded it to another agent friend I know. But the agent paid her 25,000 bucks to walk, and like that landlord didn't get any of that back pay. He just went on to the next, just to get her out of the house. But the question I wanted to ask was, I think Justice posted it. It was on an organization, basically, like small landlord organization, going after the landlord tenant board about the delays.
Yeah, I did go to that meeting actually just to like kind of observe it. And it was interesting because one of the things that came up that the lawyer said, which I found very interesting, given the stories that have been in the news articles, is that a lot of the people, and I don't know the data on this, I'm sure it's people of all backgrounds, but he commented on how a lot of the inquiries that he's getting for people that are having trouble are actually like more like immigrant, like landlords that are struggling to get like rent money or whatever, like with non-paying tenants and waiting all these long wait times. And there was actually quite a few people that showed up that were like more like newer immigrants. Like I could tell, like not newer immigrants, sorry, I could just tell by their names and their appearance and stuff that there was more like racialized people and like immigrants and stuff. And I've noticed that in the stories that we've been seeing, right? Like single moms or somebody that, like is an immigrant that has been here for a while, that had that one investment property. And so they are looking for, I think they said they're looking for like 5 people around to kind of do a lawsuit with. And basically the lawyers are doing it for free. They're not charging, but if there is cost, but if there's cost against the landlords are going to have to pay. So if it's like 5 of them, it's $100,000, whatever, they're going to have to pay that if there's cost.
Justice, this is solo landlords doing it, I think.
You're right.
And solo landlords has a spotty, questionable reputation in my mind. And they say a lot of things, and I found a lot of the things aren't true. So I don't expect any lawsuit to happen, particularly when there could be cost consequences against those who put their names forward, as key litigants. I don't think it's going to happen. These things take years in any event, and the Crown generally has immunity. No one's going to take this risk. It's interesting you say that most people, or a lot of the people you see in these stories, and I know CBC's doing a lot of online stories, and high percentage are new immigrants, but remember that a high percentage of our society in Toronto are immigrants and many new immigrants. Um, but you're right. I think one of the reasons you see a lot of immigrants in these stories is that immigrants, I think, are investors at a higher percentage than the population at large. I think it has a lot to do with realtors in the immigrant communities. I think that realtors in the immigrant communities are not as straightforward as they should be in terms of the obligations of a landlord and the risks. And I think they run into it without any knowledge or due diligence. And, this is the business I work in every day. And unfortunately, so many end up in trouble and end up at my doorstep. But it's almost every small landlord today. Somebody mentioned $20,000 before, and that's sort of becoming the new base. I mean, the 1 month compensation that's set out in the RTA is meaningless because it's tenants know that landlords can't get their place back. And I'm dealing with one right now, and we're at about 20. I'm acting for the tenant. And it's just an awful situation for landlords who thought that they had some sort of, control over their property. But you don't have property rights under the Constitution in Canada. And people wrongly believe, often again, because their realtor told them so, that they can enforce things in a lease, and they can't, because you can't contract out of your statutory obligations. So right now, it's just a god awful mess, and I've never been so busy with landlords stressed.
Can I just add something to that about the lawsuit? I kind of like Solo. They help a lot of landlords, and especially they provide help to a lot of the landlords that really are having a lot of issues because there's no guidance. Like even from our office, we tried to call the landlord and tenant board today, and I don't think we even got through, and we were on for like maybe I don't know, like several hours. And so there's really nobody who's making like assisting a lot of these people. And the reason why I think that there's a lot of immigrants and problems is because that are having problems is because they're actually targeted. English is going to be their second languages, and they're actually targeted by some of these, predatory tenants who know exactly what they're doing going into it.
But what are you saying? Language skills mean that they're stupid? I mean, that's just not the case.
I'm not saying they're stupid.
No, maybe ignorant of the RTA.
But why should language make them ignorant of the RTA? I mean, information's available in 9 different languages.
Yeah,
they just rush in. That's it.
Yeah, but Harry, you know what? They might not be familiar with things like a standard application, what a credit check looks like, what employment letters look like. Like I once spotted a scammer because they used the same address on both of their application letters for the husband and the wife, and that struck me as unusual. So I dug deeper and I called online. I mean, you shouldn't have to be a friggin' forensic analyst because there's so much tenant fraud out there. And I'm going to start, and I want to say something straightforward right now. I manage a number of properties, and like 99% of the tenants are good, but there is a certain percentage of tenants out there who are deliberately, specifically, over and over doing this kind of fraud to landlords, and they are very good at it. And somebody who may not be familiar with all of these different things may not know, and that their application is completely faked.
Well, I don't think it's 99%, first of all, but I think you have to differentiate fraud, the outright fraudsters, from those who have been living somewhere, paying their rent for 3 years, and the landlord pretends their son is moving in, and the tenant realizes it's bullshit. And now the tenant asks them for $60,000. And most of the people on this basis would say, wow, those are scammers. But you and I both know they're not scammers. They're just, taking advantage of the law that exists. But most of the people here would say those are bad tenants. And really they're not. So let's differentiate those who avail themselves of their rights under the RTA from those who enter a tenancy as scammers. Those are 1%. I'll agree with you.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
but what percentage of tenancies are bad? Small landlord, I'm not talking about institutional apartment buildings. What percentage of those are bad or go bad?
Well, it depends. I mean, and I'll be frank and say a lot of landlords really are nuts too. Like
Oh yeah.
that they can call the tenant if the guy leaves the light on in his bathroom. I had a lady friend of mine. I mean, this was years ago. She would go by the house, and her apartments were rented, utilities included, and she'd call all her tenants if the lights were left on. And I simply told her, listen, sell your property. You're not cut out for this.
Yeah.
Driving you bananas. So there's a certain subset of that population. And here's the thing. We have to where the N12 is concerned. Okay. And that's a specific application. And that's a specific thing. We can talk about that. And I'm going to say that there's a certain percentage of those that are completely given in bad faith. And there's
at least 50.
I don't know if I would say 50, but I have definitely seen them given in bad faith. And there's two reasons why they are. Let's just say there's people who have gotten bad advice, usually from a realtor. And this used to be, and I'm sorry, it's realtors, but anytime there was something going on with a tenant, it would be, well, just tell them your mother's moving in. Like it was so common and so terrible. And then every single thing. Oh, you don't like the rent they're saying, oh, just tell them your son's moving in. Like this was like very, very, very common for a long time. And it's kind of reversed itself. I mean, and we have to differentiate about the problem. Two problems. Number one, the delays at the landlord and tenant board are terrible for everybody. And I mean, we're not talking about N12s or non-payment of rent, everything. If you have your tenant or your landlord try to stab you today, right? You're not getting in there for 3 months at all. And that's not fair. I mean, like that article I shared today about social housing, they don't generally kick people out of social housing unless there's something very, very serious going on. The guy's drug dealing in the lobby, he's assaulted another tenant, like all of these kind of things. I had one time where a tenant tried to stab my superintendent. I mean, and like you need to get into court and deal with these issues quickly. And right now, the landlord and tenant board is not doing that at all. There's absolutely no recourse for anybody who has a serious issue like that to be heard in court. And that's a big problem.
How many people here are realtors? Are there many you figure, Daniel, here who are realtors?
Okay, so I'll just answer for him just because I know he's a little tied up. I would say that a good chunk from what I'm seeing are, and if not directly realtors, then some way and another connected to the industry for sure.
Well, then let me say something terrible that will scare the shit out of them, but I'm not engaging in hyperbole. I believe it to be true. You cannot sell a tenanted property today and go through the system. And that, unless the tenant's just stupid and says, sure, I'll move, you cannot win. Because let's say the average closing time on a real estate deal is 90 days, and the average time to complete an eviction from beginning to end is a year. Well, the buyer's not going to hold on for a year. So it is absolutely impossible and irresponsible and probably negligent to tell your seller client that he can sell his tenanted house. Now, there are things you can do to mitigate in terms of things in the APS and an affidavit from the buyer, lots of things, but you can't just win by evicting them because the timing problem is too perverse.
Yeah, I've seen, like, at the beginning of COVID, we were seeing a lot of delays, like closings get delayed because everybody's trying to figure out what was actually like going to be the ultimate solution. And then I think the board never ultimately arrived at one. So you're seeing a lot of creativity evolve. I think cash for keys probably being the most common because there is so much upside on these older stale rents. And it is a bit of a shame to see, like, because a lot of these people being displaced from the apartments that they've been in for 10, 20, 30 years have to now move, you know,
But even cash
60,
for
70
keys isn't
kilometers.
even cash for keys isn't what it was. It used to be,
For sure, yeah.
10, 15 years ago, it was give them a couple of months. But when rent inflation, well, maybe not today, but when rent inflation for the last 5 years has been, let's say, 5 times true inflation, across Ontario in a breadbasket of goods and services, then for a tenant to take a month's rent, let's say $2,000, and his rent's going to go up $800 a month to find the new place. Well, in 2.5 months, he's out money. You don't need 2.5 months. You need 10 months. You need 20 months because rents go up sometimes, in many cases, $1,000 a month when you move out of an old place. So everybody says cash for keys, Daniel. Like, you go to the
Yeah,
online forums,
I can give
cash
some real
cash for keys.
examples. So like I just saw cash for keys that was two units in a fiveplex that were 2-year payouts at the current rent, and that might
2 years.
buy the person
Sure.
a year of rent in a new unit.
But what does the small landlord think is reasonable? His hairdresser told him 1 month.
Well, the
So it
thing
must be.
is, though, I mean, if you look at if it's a 5 cap asset, let's say, every time you increase rent by $1,000, it increases the value of the property. And so a lot of them quantify it that way. And we're seeing people try and sell vacant. So I think that this hot investment sales market has really put a lot of pressure, and it is winding down now. Like, I think it's pretty well dropped off completely, but it has definitely manifested in a lot of problems for tenants and a lot of displacement of tenants, which is, you don't like to see that, obviously, right?
Yeah, it's and sometimes the tenant actually, or the landlord and tenant actually want to enter into an agreement so that they can keep the tenant, where the tenant's paying $1,800 and the guideline says he can go up to $1,860, but the landlord and tenant both know he's paying $800 a month too cheap, so they agree, okay, let's just agree to go up to $2,200. And they even sign something that the rent will go up to $2,200. And the landlord's pretty happy and the tenant's pretty happy because it's a fair number. But of course, it's illegal and it's not enforceable. So even that remedy, which is a good remedy, is taken away by the RTA.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of individuals try and use that, and we advise against it, obviously, because it creates risk for the new purchaser, whoever's holding the asset now, at that new value. Because at any point, the tenant could say, "Hey, I didn't," or "This was an illegal rent increase," and they could claw back all of that
Any
money.
point up to 1 year. The increase becomes legal a year after it's first charged. So yeah, the tenant can just wait 11 months, see if he likes the new landlord,
Right.
and then not only file an application to reduce the rent back to what it was, but of course get all that excess for the last 11 months back.
Yeah, interesting insight. Go ahead, Rochelle. Sorry.
So here's the thing. I mean, this heated COVID market and the heated rental market, and now interest rate increases have created a desperation in the market that I have never seen. And honestly, like, there's been a trend over the last, I would say, like 10 years, but I've really seen it during the last let's say 5 years, where landlords, like, housing is a service, right? Like if you're a student, right, you don't really expect that you're going to buy a house as soon as you leave your house, or you're in transition, or you don't have a good job, or like all these life stages. But the way that our market is structured in Canada and has created this like story that we all need to be homeowners, that we all want to be landlords and all of this stuff, and the money isn't there. Like that's like an underlying issue. The cap rates, the true cap rates are negative. uh, Landlords, like there was this article from CIBC like years back where condo landlords were on an average paying $1,000 a month into their investment. Now that's before all these interest rate increases. So you have to figure at some point there's going to be like a serious backlash, because the landlords are also now like hurting for money. They're not all big corporate landlords. Some of them are okay. Some of them are definitely not. Some of them need to rent their home to break even, to pay their own expenses. And so, this is the problem. It's created this huge perverse incentive to dehouse tenants and nothing to replace it. And
But a backlash by who?
a backlash like in society against landlords. Like we have become like the biggest, scummiest,
Yeah.
like it used to be like, I mean, when I was, originally a property manager, I was never called names. I was never vilified. You didn't hear like half of this like slumlord, how like all of these like things like people are like people with multiple houses are like
Yeah. They're
terrible and
scum.
all of
They're
this stuff.
scum today.
Yeah, and so that has changed. And it's like if you say to people, well, this is a legitimate business and I'm just providing a service like a grocery store provides food, like nobody's going after Galen Weston and saying you're responsible for all the starving people because you charge too much for food and you should give it to them for free. And we should allow all the homeless to sit in your store for 12 months and eat, and you can't call the police to get them out while you pay for all their food. I mean, nobody is saying that. And I'm saying like against landlords in particular, there's been this enormous backlash that is very troubling. And I think a lot of that rhetoric is fueled, and I'm not sure exactly where it comes from. And then there's like, it's like there's a certain subset of people that think it's fun to screw the landlord. And then the other part of that is that in our buildings, we are not allowed to have like regular rules. Like people can smoke, we can't kick them out. They can do all kinds of things. They can party till 3 a.m. And you can't like go to the LTB, even like the 10-month waiting aside, and say like, Patty from Unit A can't keep the whole building up till 3 a.m. with all her friends, and actually kick her out without like some kind of, I'm going to say like crazy level of evidence that she's actually done it. Tenants testifying against her, which of course they're not going to want to do because Patty and her friends are not nice people, and so on and so forth. So it's really created this huge problem where we can't really maintain order and anything goes. Right? Like,
I think Peter had a question or his hand up.
No question. I think Ottawa Small Landlords, your mic is on. I don't know if they wanted to say anything.
Oh, thanks, Peter. Yes, I was trying to raise my hand, but I couldn't figure that out. Hey, Daniel, how's it going, man?
I'm good. Yeah, no complaints. I'm actually in Calgary here, heading to an event. But the thread that we had going earlier in the week, had really prompted me to want to have this conversation. So I'm curious to get your insight on what's going on.
Yeah, it's great. Hey, I also want to say hi, Rochelle, good to see you or hear you. And hey, Harry,
Uh,
always great to hear your insights there. And
Thank you.
we're connected in different groups and stuff. But I think Rochelle brought up a good point where the landlord image is taking a beating for sure, and some of it is well deserved. When you see some of the things that are happening out there, but what I'm seeing here, and I'll speak for for small landlords, at least here in Ottawa. I'm not going to talk about other places, but I think there's definitely the a lot of new regulations are being put in place at the city level, and a lot of it has to do because they're trying to for affordable housing reasons, and uh, they're really pushing landlords, property owners, rental owners to how do I say it? They're just creating they're making it very difficult to be landlords. And while they're doing that, they're painting small landlords and institutional size landlords as the greedy type, as Rochelle was saying, the greedy and scuzzy type, and all landlords are bad, and which really isn't the case. And I find that's too bad. And another thing too that's happening is that we know in social media world and other places, and even some lawyers and definitely some social housing people are promoting or teaching tenants how to take advantage out there in RTA world and landlord tenant board world. It's unfortunate because I think we're all better off when tenants know their rights and they follow them, they adhere to their responsibilities in the RTA. But many times we are seeing tenants, they're being told what their rights are, but is it morally right to ask landlords or demand 50K, 60K, 100K from landlords? Our own paralegal process 430 N11s in 2021, and they were all for worth 5K to 150K each.
Wow.
Yeah. And that was because tenants didn't want to move out when new tenants were coming in, or the property was sold, or there were rent arrears, the rent theft, as I call it. So, it's they're being taught how to do this in some social media groups and other places. And hey, in Ottawa, there was a group here and an individual who put an ad out, an op-ed saying "keep your rent," right, and it was published in the big.
That happened during COVID all over Toronto too.
Yeah, and
don't pay your landlord, keep your rent.
Yeah,
it's absolutely.
It didn't help that on March the 15th, Doug Ford went on TV and he said, if you can't pay your rent, don't pay your rent. And that was the start of the Parkdale Organize and the Don't Pay Your Rent movement. It's interesting. We have a conservative government, or a so-called conservative government in Ontario. So if we have these problems now, forget the wait times. That's a different issue. But just the legislation, which makes it difficult to be a landlord. If this is what we get under the Conservatives, can you imagine what would happen under the Liberals or the NDP? I mean, it will be an end to vacancy decontrol, which means rents don't go up when a unit becomes empty. But we can't even get help as landlords with the Conservative government. It's just unbelievable. Because there are more tenants than landlords.
But Harry, you bring up a good point. If anybody wants to know where things are going, and you can write this down if you don't write anything else down, is that right now, I'm just going to say the forces are organizing to eliminate like vacancy decontrol, which is when the property becomes vacant, you can put the rent up to as much as you want. So the market is going in that direction. Like all of this bad news, all this landlord vilification, all the rent increase, there's been a lot of press lately about above the guideline rent increases because they just got processed, and how the tenants didn't pay their above the guideline rent increase for like 3 years. And now they're all being evicted because the amount that they owe is like $3,000 a piece or something. So all of that is leading to like rent control that was in place when I was first in the business, where you could not raise your rent between tenants. There was a log between, there was a log at the government essentially, and they told you how much rent you could charge, and that's what you charged. And it was based on the amount of rent that was charged when the unit was rented, when it became a law. So that's where they're headed. And, you know, tell me, I mean, that I can like smell them now. I've been doing this a long time, and it's like that's where they're headed, because the rents have gone up tremendously. The prices of real estate have gone up tremendously. Right now, the interest rates are going up tremendously. And so there's been no respect at all for landlording as a business, that you are allowed to make money in any business. You're actually supposed to make money. And so that's the next spot they're going, where they just declare vacancy decontrol is over and you are stuck with your rent at the time that it's rented. That's my prediction right now, where we're going.
Well, the Toronto Star's actually run articles on those before, like recently, I think in the last year.
Correct. That's
Yes.
Tell me, like, Harry, you've been around the block.
Hell, Harry, you might have even wrote it.
I mean, vacancy decontrol existed before 1998, with the rent registry, and I don't think the Conservatives will bring it back. In the last election, even the Liberals didn't quite promise it, but things have changed a lot, as Rochelle says, and with rents going up so much, it's got to come back. There's another part to this. I act for landlords and I act for tenants, and I think a lot of people who are only landlords tend to, somebody was talking about in Ottawa how tenants are extorting, although you didn't use the word, that sort of money for N11s. But it's sort of ironic, because on one hand, landlords are saying we want the free market. We want to be able to make money. It's a business. On the other hand, landlords don't like it when tenants, want to negotiate freely. And, if nobody has to take the offer of 100,000 or 50,000 or 30,000, it's, and I often say to landlords, and I do mean it, that nobody twisted their arm and made them become landlords. I mean, anybody who gets into the business today and then complains, like, I don't know about anybody else, I got no sympathy, because this is a business that people have decided to go into because you can't make money working as an employee all your life. So this was people's way to become rich. And obviously, you can make more money, you think, in this business than in other types of investments. With more return comes more risk. And I don't have a lot of sympathy for landlords who go into the business today without doing their due diligence, because it's a shitty business right now. And as some have said already, it's going to get worse. It's not going to get better. There's no factors that I can see that are going to make it get better. And these foolish people, often with the help of their realtors who are foolish, I have an expression I also use sometimes with landlords, is it's the only business I know of in the whole world where the customer knows more about the business than the business owner. That is perverse. And that's your fault. When I say you, I'm talking about the small landlord, not necessarily you. How in the world do you get into a fucking business where you let the customer know more than you do? And yeah, I'm angry about it. It's crazy. If you were going to open a dry cleaning store, you'd find out about how the dry cleaning business works and the laws about chemicals, and you'd find out about employment standards, and you'd find out lots of stuff. It's a business. It's not passive investment. So there's a rant for you, and I'd love to hear some comments.
I'm of the opinion that being a landlord is very much a service business. We talk about it all the time, and I say it to a lot of my investors. And it's like, if you can't hire somebody to manage your property, you better be prepared to do it on your own, because it really is. It's not a passive income stream at all. If you want passive real estate investing, you got to go REIT side. And
Yeah.
people want the hard asset, and they want the exposure to leverage. And if you want those benefits, you have to take the risks. And I think a lot of people, for the past 25 years, we've been in a very risk-off environment for Canadian real estate, and people are now very upset that risk is being realized on all fronts, like interest rate increases, price decreases, vacancy risk, policy risk, and so I mean the market's definitely in a weird place trying to price discover around all of these factors. And I think it's going to take us years to solve most of these problems. I think the economy might do like 30% of the work, but I think and maybe we can use this to segue into how do we, if anybody else wants to touch on this, the service aspect of real estate or real estate investing, but also, really want to talk about how do we fix this problem as individuals, like as tenants or landlords, but also from a policy perspective, is there a meaningful way you can even solve this problem? Go ahead, Justice.
So I just wanted to echo what Harry was saying in a way, when you look at some of the stories that were in the news, I post them, and a lot of the people that respond to the thread say, well, why didn't they know this? Why didn't they know that? They did this wrong, or didn't their realtor know? So there is a lot of what he's saying that is relevant. In a lot of the landlord stories that do go public, there is some kind of a fault somewhere in terms of the realtor or the landlord not doing their due diligence. But one thing I must say, with a lot of the people that are suffering from rent increases and not being able to pay the rent, I've seen some of the above guideline increases in Thorncliffe area. A lot of those people are new immigrants. A lot of them are low income. They some of them won't be able to afford that. They might not even be able to afford a 4.5 increase. I think what the government has failed on repeatedly is social housing. I mean, if you look at the current number of people waiting in Toronto right now, at this very moment, it's over 80,000 people waiting for housing. Most of our housing in Ontario is provided by the private sector. Social housing is only a small percentage. I think Ontario has 285,000 social housing units. For every unit that they also lose a lot of units as time passes. So I think that that's a big problem, is that we're depending on a private landlord, on a private system to provide housing for people. And I think people are just kind of getting creative with making their own social housing. You look at these international students, they can only afford $400. Yeah. So people are let's just put 20 mattresses in there and we're going to give them social housing. That's not really good social housing. But if you didn't have that, they would be on the street. That's the crazy part of it. So I think that we need to pressure the government to say that, we want people to have respectable housing. If you can't do it, get a public builder. But, this country, Canada, used to build 20,000 social housing units per year.
But not anymore, that's for sure. And who's the biggest slumlord in Toronto?
Toronto housing. You can go to any Toronto housing building. I sometimes work with clients that are in Toronto housing. It is heartbreaking. When I leave, the first thing I do is put everything in the laundry, because I'm so scared of bed bugs. I'm frightened of it. So you have kids living in that. You have kids living in, buildings where there's gang violence. There's been shootings at these buildings and stuff. So it's very concerning. And Ontario's actually only built 20,000 affordable housing units in the past 20 years. So I think that we really do need to get serious about deeply affordable housing and also protecting rentals that are affordable. I know not everybody likes that because, they want those units and they'd love to build something else there, but we need those units.
Well, it's heartening to see, and not everybody believes this, John Tory's new superpowers, because John Tory wanted to, I think, allow rooming houses throughout the city, and he didn't even bring it to council because he knew he didn't have the support. But now he has the power to do that. And when you talk about students and immigrants, my God, the international students living in fire traps in basements, and they do die from time to time. Not often. It's surprising, not that often. But I would love to see rooming houses legalized everywhere, because that's one of the ways to get not the lowest affordable housing, but at least affordable housing, is to have the structure of a rooming house where you have a common kitchen and a common living room, and it's just a matter of square footage per unit.
I find it wild, Harry, that Toronto doesn't have a rooming house bylaw. Is that the case? Is that
Well, it never got harmonized
yeah?
with the mega city, and only Etobicoke and Toronto have a rooming house bylaw. But that doesn't mean the neighbors will let you, even in those cities,
Sure.
will not oppose those.
Yeah, and it's rooming houses are a really good solution moving forward for affordable housing, uh, subsidized housing, whatever you want to call it. Renting rooms out is much cheaper than renting a 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, whatever you have there. So yeah, I wasn't sure if Toronto, when people were talking about rooming house, I wasn't sure if they were talking multifamily residential or real rooming houses here. Ottawa has its rooming house bylaw, so we're cool here. They just updated it a couple of years ago.
Another thing I would like to point out is that that condos are not a substitute for purpose-built housing. And I first spoke about this many years ago because I became aware that part of the government's housing solution was to get these ma and pa landlords to essentially subsidize purpose-built rental buildings. And at the time, if you built one condo on one side of the street and purpose-built rental housing on the other side of the street, the taxes on the purpose-built rental were easily double what the condo building would pay if it was identical, because of the mill rate for multi-residential. And a lot of people are not kind of aware of mill rates and taxations for different types of multi-residential. But now when you build multi-residential, you are able to have the same taxation as a condo. Unfortunately, nobody even now is meaningfully building multi-residential. And the problem with that is that even if you have 100, let's say you have 100-unit building and it's owned by one guy and he sells it to another guy, guess how many of the tenants get displaced? 0. If you have 100 units in the condo building across the street and all those 100 investors at different times decide to sell their investment, guess how many of the tenants will be displaced? And the answer is a hell of a lot of them. And so there's a significant difference between those two different kinds of investment. And it really ticked me off when the city was giving land away for a quote unquote affordable housing that was not affordable at all, to condo buildings. And I'm like, well, you have to create a different zoning for multi-residential because it is different and it protects the rights of tenants differently.
Right.
And it makes a home, people can stay there for 20 years. When I was managing a building, I had a lady there who was 96 years old, who had been there since the building was built, and there's a community and people could stay. You never see that in condos now because people will sell the unit. And it's the landlord's greatest nightmare to have a tenant that would stay in a condo for 20 years.
We'll push them out.
Because the maintenance fee goes up every friggin' year 10%. The property taxes go up. Everything goes up. And then they see they rented I rented units, let's say at Sherway Gardens for $1,200 back in the day. I forget when it was, years and years and years ago. They were $1,200 for 1 bedroom for probably about 5 years when those buildings first went up. Now those same units are going for $2,200. So can you imagine how that landlord would be if he's watching everybody around getting $2,400 a month on, and he's getting $1,200 from his tenant, and meanwhile his maintenance fees are $800 and his mortgage is $700, and he's subsidizing for all those reasons.
And he can't do an above guideline application based on his maintenance fees.
Oh, absolutely. That's not allowed, which is completely ludicrous. I'm just going to say that. Vastly unfair.
Absolutely.
But
You know, it was unfair when in 2017, Kathleen Wynne arbitrarily, prior to her, it was one of her Hail Marys before she got defeated, she changed the above guideline rules, which used to be for capital expenditures, taxes, or utilities, and she just arbitrarily took away utilities. And so if a landlord pays for utilities and they've tripled, you can no longer, since 2017, do an Aggie on utilities. And when she was asked, you know, how can you do that? She said landlords should buy energy efficient appliances. Well, what if landlords were already buying energy efficient appliances and their utility cost tripled? It was a shameful government Hail Mary to help her with a segment of people. And yet, just as shameful was Doug Ford not changing it back.
yeah, well, Doug Ford needs to get his shit together because he's like one of my least favorite people in the world because honestly, like the destruction of the courts, okay, and the length of time that it is taking and the delays entirely rest on him. And, like, it's not like Kathleen Wynne was like how she was, and she made a lot of things, and I was not a fan of her either. But the way that Doug Ford has continually refused to fund the landlord and tenant board so that they can resume regular operations is completely shameful. And a lot of people don't know this, and I don't know if Harry knows it, but I do actually from time to time represent tenants. And one of the tenants was the one who ended up in the Globe. And one of the reasons that it ended up in the Globe was because the amount was shocking. But the reason it was shocking is because that landlord can actually be found on that was moving in, was actually owned like 9 condos. And so we're like, this guy is not moving into this guy's basement apartment. And we figured out how much extra rent and how much it would cost to move the guy. And that's how the number came up. And so, like, a lot of people don't understand that. There is like a lot of scammers, as Harry said, that are asking for these things. And I'm not in favor of that. But there's also other stories, like during COVID, there was, and I'm going to talk again about some other like basement apartments where the owner lives in the house. Okay. And I've talked about this before. So there is so many of those that are empty in this world. Like in Toronto, you would not believe how many units are now empty because those landlords cannot make a rule. And if they can make a rule, they can't enforce it. I'll give you an example. There is this one lady. She was allergic to smoke. Her tenant smoked. Not only did her tenant smoke, her tenant moved in a freaking pot-bellied pig and 3 dogs and I think a cat. And she's allergic, but she didn't care about the stupid pets. Although it was like fantastic that this lady thought she could move a pig into a basement apartment and not even explain, like ask ahead of time, but whatever. But the problem was the smoke. And then the landlord and tenant board, this lady went to the landlord and tenant board and says the tenant smokes at this and this time, and these are the problems. And they wouldn't give her eviction because she couldn't prove that the tenant was smoking. And the tenant said, like, no, I don't smoke, which was completely, ludicrous. And we see this all the time. Like tenants will go to the landlord and tenant board and just like outright lie, and then the landlord will say, no, that's not true. And their like evidence is taken completely at face value, even though it makes absolutely no sense. And because I don't know why that is. And then like in other jurisdictions, like other in other provinces, there's such a thing called substantial compliance, so that your forms are not thrown out because of a clerical error. Well, not at the Ontario Landlord and Tenant Board. If you don't dot every T and dot every I, you're confusing your tenant and he doesn't understand that he has to pay rent. I'm going to give you an example. If you write October 1 to October 30 instead of October 31 on your N4, it will get kicked out. Why? I don't know. That's just the way it is. Or if you write October 1 to November 1, that's another popular way that people screw up their forms. It's non-payment of rent. That will also get thrown out. So these are the kind of nitpicky things that the landlord and tenant board is saying confuse tenants. Now, I've been a tenant before. I mean, I'm not confused. I know my rent has to be paid. I certainly know it has to be paid within 10 months. And like, I'm not confused if I got an N4 and it said October 1 to November 1. I wouldn't immediately think that I don't owe rent. But that's how the landlord and tenant board is. And they don't allow any reasonable exceptions to the law, and they make it like impossible for landlords to do business in Ontario unless the landlord knows the law like very and is able. There's no real way to protect yourself. And a lot of times, like for example, lawn care and snow removal is a requirement. The landlord has to provide that. But a lot of lease clauses say the tenant's going to do it. Well, what if the tenant doesn't do it? Well, now the landlord has to pay to do it, and that's not included in the rent. So, like,
But that's part of being a landlord is you have to add some value, right? You can't like maintaining the property is part of the it's an obligation you're taking on when you choose to become a landlord. So I'm not quite sure why that is a complaint there.
well, if you're managing, like, if you have a bunch of single family homes, sir, and you are trying to hire a contractor to go and do it, it's going to cost you $200 a house. Are you going to be able to charge an extra $200 rent because you provide those services?
Well,
And
that's
I'm
up to
just
the
saying that's
particular
a common
finances of
clause.
your situation. That's up to the particular finances of your situation. If you cannot afford to maintain several properties, you probably shouldn't have several properties.
That's not the point. The point is that isn't it more efficient for a tenant who potentially would like to have that savings in the rent? Say, I'll shovel
Sure,
a
if the
4-foot
tenant wants
driveway.
to, if
But
the
he's not
tenant
allowed to
wants,
do that. That's not allowed under the RTA. So you must provide that service. You must pay for that service as the landlord, or you must try and convolutedly, like, I mean, these are things. Tenants are not children. They understand, at least partially, what they're getting into. When a lease says no smoking and they smoke in the same house as the owner, they know what they're doing. When they sign a lease that says, I'm going to do the snow removal on my 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom house in Aurora, for example, with like maybe a 20-foot driveway, they understand what they're getting into. And then they move in and then they say, no, you have to provide it. Well, that's like pretty unfair
but
dealing.
you have, as I said, you then an individual who is not ready to maintain a property they're trying to rent out as a professional landlord, then should not become a landlord. And if your argument is, well, I have 5 single family detached properties, it's going to cost me a lot to maintain those 5 in terms of the summer, in terms of pool cleaning, in terms of snow removal, then you shouldn't be a landlord for 5 properties. It's a separate question whether or not you can find a tenant who is going to take on those responsibilities. That's a separate question. But the point here is that uh, it should not be a complaint that I have to do it now, because that is the obligation. That is a duty as a landlord that you're choosing to take on when you become a landlord.
Okay, so can you explain to me why that's a standard clause in like 99.9% of ORIA leases that I see, the Ontario real estate leases? And the other common clause that I see is that the tenant is going to pay $50 of the maintenance when it comes. Like, why aren't those clauses removed? I mean, there's a bunch of realtors here. I'm just going to ask straight out, why are those clauses still there?
Well,
Well,
AREA has done a terrible job of creating proper clauses for rentals. They've frankly done a terrible job of creating a paradigm, a system for renting, which exposes the landlord, prospective landlord, terribly to human rights complaints because they treat leasing a unit the same way they treat a purchase and sale, where they encourage realtors to accept an offer irrevocable, one at a time, serially, as opposed to in parallel, which means you have to either accept or reject. And once you reject, the tenant says, well, why didn't you accept me? As opposed to the way good landlords do it without realtors, and that is taking applications, going through 20 of them, finding the best ones, doing credit checks. Realtor doesn't have a fucking clue how tenancies work. And I read these Form 400s just like you do, Rochelle, and they're just full of crap. But it's not because of the realtors, it's because they were trained. And whoever trained them. But you're right, AREA has provided no guidance on how realtors should do things.
Exactly. And then I'll reveal this now because a lot of people may not know this. Yes, I own my own home, but my son was in school, and his school, 2 people were shot and 1 kid died. So I'm moving from my area. So I'm actually looking for a space myself, another house close to a better school, which is quite reasonable under the circumstances. And so I can't tell you how many times I have gone to houses and they say, well, you have to offer X amount of rent up front. It's not just me. There's a lot. And this is going on. And I'm just saying this actually because I happen to be looking myself. And I have another person that I know is a professional person also looking. And we're both seeing the same thing. We're like, what the fuck is wrong with these people? You know, and you're not, you haven't even put in your offer yet. And the realtor is telling you, hey, if you don't offer 6 months rent up front, you're not going to be considered for this place.
Now, but wait a minute. You've been wearing your landlord hat since we started at 8 o'clock. And now because you're looking as a tenant, you're trashing this practice, which is completely illegal, but completely understandable. When people used to ask for a 1-month rent deposit, it's because they could get to the LTB in 6 weeks. So when they finally evicted, they wouldn't be out much money. Now it takes a year to evict. They ask for, I'm not saying it's legal. I try not to look at it from a moral perspective. People are doing, incentives determine outcome. No landlord in their right mind would take somebody with 1 month's deposit over somebody with 6 months deposit. And it's not legal. And I can probably get in trouble as a member of the Law Society for saying it makes sense, but it does make sense.
I understand the rationale behind it. I completely understand it.
But you disagree with it, but you think it's okay that tenants should have to shovel their own snow.
Yes.
So I don't get that.
Well, I mean, if I was like renting a house, which I will be, I certainly wouldn't expect my landlord or even want my landlord to shovel my snow. Like, what is the point of that? Like, if I wanted that, I would go rent a condo.
So in your mind, what value does a landlord add in modern society then? If they're not, is it just a simple fact of ownership? Is that the only value they add?
Well, yes. Because here's the thing. Not everybody is in a position of ownership. Like if every landlord in this country decided to sell their property today, do you think those Indian students who are paying $4 a month's rent for a room would qualify to buy the house?
Prices would plummet and the houses would get bought. And I thought that question, I'm not sure who asked it, it was extremely insightful because I didn't want to say this earlier.
That was me because in my
opinion, who is me? I don't see you speaking here.
Siberi 6 Real Estate.
Oh, okay. Sam. Because, it's a legitimate position that property ownership for the purpose of investment is not a legitimate operation. And if the only reason you're able to do it is because you happen to have access to money and you're really not providing anything other, then, Marx was right. Property ownership for the purpose of speculation or for having a tenant pay your mortgage is not a legitimate activity. Now, I'm throwing that out there because I'm sounding like the only tenant guy here, so I want to provide some balance. But I don't think landlords provide much. I think they think it's a passive investment where they happen to have enough for a down payment, and they're in business. I don't think that's sufficient.
Well, I think just to give some context into what I said about in terms of that question, I do think there are landlords who definitely provide value, but those landlords, and by the way, just to make clear, I'm a real estate agent,
Yep.
so I make money. The more landlords there are, the more real estate investors there are, the more money I make. But the point of the matter is that the landlords who truly add value, in my experience, are very few and far between. And I'm
And
lucky
provide
enough.
service.
Exactly. I
Be
mean,
polite to their tenants. Respect them.
but
My
I
God,
I
I
I
spent my whole
understand.
career. I spent my whole career representing landlords, and I've started to disdain landlords.
Well, I'm not going to go that far, but I'm just saying that. Look, ultimately, I think just to maybe steer the direction of the conversation a bit more, is there is this misconception from both landlords and tenants and real estate agents, to be honest with you, that what a rental transaction is much like a purchase and sale transaction.
Right.
And that is the utterly the worst way to look at it from all sides. And I see this from landlords, I see this from real estate agents as well. They should not be looking at it as a business transaction. It is a marriage. When you're entering into a rental agreement, you have to look at it as if you're entering into a marriage between two people. And that is a much more accurate way to look at rental arrangements.
God
And to give
bless.
you an example, I have to talk so many of my landlord clients out of accepting tenants purely based upon the basis that they're offering more. And for instance, I just rented out a property in North York, Toronto, sorry, 2 weeks ago, and my landlord wanted to go with an offer that was 2,700, as opposed to another tenant offer we had that was at 2,500. I asked them why. He said, "Well, they're paying higher. They're paying $200 more." But the tenant portfolio was not even comparable. The people offering 2,500 were far better tenants in every sense of the term. So that is just an example of how landlords sometimes look at the renting as if they're selling a property, as if it's only about the price. Same thing with agents. A lot of agents do the same thing as well, wherein they try to go back if there's multiple offers on a rental property. They try to go back to all the tenants and say, improve your offer. This is not purchase and sale. That is, in my opinion, improving your offer is a completely irrelevant point. I'm not saying cash flow is not important. I'm just saying you're prioritizing the wrong things. Tenant quality is the paramount thing that should be prioritized, as opposed to price or any other terms that is more indicative of a purchase and sale. And that's just my basic stance on it. So
And
I really think there's a lot of guilt to go around on that regard between
Yeah.
everyone.
I think
Agreed.
that goes back to, the when you say agents, and I totally agree. I'd have to say, most agents shouldn't be helping landlords find tenants. Maybe they can find people, but they don't have the skill sets or experience to screen them properly, to do everything else that needs to be done to ensure that they're satisfactory, and building those relationships. It's like their tenants are clients.
Mhm.
That's what they are, and they're people. And I think small landlords, like people here in Ottawa, we try to you treat people right, and treat them as you'd want to be treated. And I'm also of the mindset that most agents shouldn't even be helping people buy investment properties or rental properties, because they don't own them themselves. How can you help someone buy a rental property if you don't have the experience or knowledge, and help them get leased? Like, you don't have any RTA experience or LTB experience. That's very concerning. But I wanted to sort of maybe go back to Daniel's question about the policy changes. Is that okay, Daniel, if I ask a couple of things?
Yeah, go ahead. I was going
Absolutely.
to fill in from. Go ahead.
Yeah, it
Ottawa.
was really and with Osla here in Ottawa, what our goal is to help educate and let city councilors and city staff know about the issues that impact small landlords. And obviously, the LTB and the RTA are significant. And the challenge is that the city level municipalities, it's outside of the like they don't have any powers when it comes to the RTA or LTB. So all I try to do is, ask as many times I can, please write to the province and have them fix the LTB and RTA and try to provide them with solutions and just let them know also that in addition to the things I mentioned earlier, that whenever the city passes municipal bylaws, rental housing bylaws, and even housing bylaws, the LTB impacts those bylaws. For example, the vacant unit tax bylaw that was passed, we asked for an exemption for for small landlords who are leaving their units vacant because of the LTB. The risk was too high. This was at the height of the pandemic, with the rent strikers and everything else. So from our organization perspective is we try to educate city councilors and we want them to raise the issues up to the provincial governments and provincial parties, the MPPs, so that they can take action. And we look to other organizations at the provincial level. Solo does good work. Ontario Landlords Watchers, FURPO. There's a whole bunch of them, and so we lean on them to make all the lobbying or to do the lobbying at the provincial level. But really, our goal here is to try to minimize the impact of the LTB on small landlords when the city is introducing residential rental bylaws. So that's our solution here, at least here in Ottawa, but I'd be interested in hearing what others are doing.
Well, I certainly think there's an awful lot of housing stock that's undiscovered in people's basement apartments that people are refusing to rent because of issues that they've had in the past.
Or that they read about.
Yeah, or that they
Yeah,
read. And I
it's
mean,
true.
like, I've done a lot, like, honestly, like, I work with small landlords. I don't work in commercial. Like, I mean, I have my own portfolio of properties that I manage for landlords. And I can tell you right now that you will never hear me asking for multiple months of rent or having an auction increasing the rent price. Or doing any of those kind of things. My job's there to protect the landlord. But I can tell you this, one of the only evictions that happened during COVID was a lady who had this guy in her basement apartment who was escalating to the point of domestic violence almost, who was not her spouse or anything, but was doing things very similar, keying the car, breaking down doors, like all of these things. The police were involved on multiple occasions. There was 70 pages of log, okay, to get this guy out of her house. Okay, now that's an extreme example because that was during COVID when they weren't hearing anything but the most extreme impaired safety. But even today, that lady would be in danger. People have had to leave their homes because they were in danger. I at one point, like a couple years ago, I had this guy who thought the landlord was poisoning him. He was like convinced and out of his mind. And she's waiting and waiting and waiting. She'll never, ever, ever rent her basement apartment again. Right. And so there's like this undiscovered stock of rental housing in people's houses. But as long as we vilify landlords, because these are not like professional landlords. And I mean, Harry, you say like, oh, these people should know the rules, but your position is also, I've heard you say it, that if people knew the rules, they'd never fucking rent anything.
Right, I agree. The rules shouldn't be. The rules shouldn't be what they are. but the rules are what they are.
Yeah, I
So
mean,
they shouldn't become landlords. And I agree with you 100%. There are hundreds of thousands of basement apartments. And, you know, people need them more today than ever before. I've heard of friends of mine who are renting out both like their basement in their house and a third floor of their house because of what's happened with interest rates. They can no longer pay their mortgages. More than ever before, people would be willing to accept tenants because they need to.
yeah.
But the government, for all we may scream, the government should make it so that it's not a dangerous situation for landlords and so that it's fair and equal. The government's not going to do it because that's not the way society is going. Society is going left, if I can become a little political. Society is becoming woke. There are more tenants than landlords. Every political party is moving left. So maybe you can say, and you'd be right, and I know it's sad, I've given up. Because I don't think no matter what the Ottawa landlords or you or I do, or FURPO, I don't think it's going to get better. And that's terrible because there are hundreds of thousands of basements, but nobody's listening to you and me.
That's kind of true.
I won't disagree, Harry.
I don't know what has to happen. I just don't know. I mean, 20 years I've been sort of watching this as an adjudicator for the first 3 years of my life in this, and then it's a paralegal, and it's just gotten worse.
I would
worse and worse.
I think it's right now with the housing crisis, just the LTB delays. They keep tenants housed, right? Fewer tenants get evicted, and that's exactly what a couple of city councillors here said last May. They came right out and said, yeah, but no, we don't support. They actually support the LTB delays because it keeps tenants housed, and I understand that. Like I understand like at a high level sort of thing, but it does much more damage than it does keeping some tenants housed.
To put things in some perspective, the Human Rights Tribunal is at a 3-year delay, as is the Immigration and Refugee Board for hearings. So it's not just the LTB, but the LTB, you know, people talk about delays in courts, whatever court, but the LTB is different because in most civil courts, by the time you file in court, the damage is crystallized. There's no longer damage happening. You're suing for damage that has happened. But in a landlord-tenant relationship, it's not like that. The damage gets worse every month as another month goes unpaid. And that I could compare that again to the Human Rights Tribunal, where there was an incident that happened 2 years ago. Well, the incident's frozen in time, but our rents aren't frozen in time. It is so unfair to have these delays while arrears or damage or conduct continues to escalate. But that's what it is.
You know, the other day, I was listening to a hearing, and there was a tenant there who had dealing with a matter from the year 2017.
Terrible.
2017. Now, you know, and I mean, I've been kicked out of landlord groups for saying that landlords and tenants can get together on certain issues. And I mean, delay at the landlord and tenant board doesn't really benefit anybody except for scammers.
Yeah. But there are lots of people that aren't paying their rent. When I get a new client today, rarely nowadays, and this never happened before, rarely do I end up at the LTB because I try every which way, even if it costs my client a lot of money, to settle it without going to the LTB, because it'll cost them more money going to the LTB, because when the tenant stops paying rent and you get a 3-year unrecoverable debt, that's expensive.
It's true. It's absolutely true. And the tenants that are expert, like if you or I decided today that we would move into a house and not rent, okay, Harry, I'm going to say that I could probably go, depending, I would say like probably at least 2 years, probably 3 years if the landlord.
Yeah, remember that there's the appeal process too. I mean, it only costs $200 if you finally lose at the LTB to go to divisional court and file an appeal. and then the landlord has to get a lawyer.
Yeah.
So there's another 10, 15,000.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, how long could it?
Yeah.
How long could you stay in there, Harry? How long?
Well, not a lot of people here probably know this, but tenants or landlords have by right, in other words, without any precondition, can file an appeal at the Superior Court if they lose at the LTB, and that's slow and that's expensive. And you don't have to have a good reason to file an appeal. You can just file by right. Section 210 of the RTA. It's terrible.
Absolutely. And but, Harry, do you think you could stay?
3 years, yeah.
Yeah.
Certainly without paying rent. And if I ain't got nothing, then I got nothing to lose. So people on the fringes of society, you know, the Human Rights Code says that I cannot discriminate against who I rent to, but in reality, just like in reality, I understand landlords collecting 12 months rent. In reality, I understand them not renting to people that don't have a AAA covenant. I mean, people say, should you rent on people to OW or ODSP? I'm not going to answer it here because I'm not supposed to. But, you know, the Human Rights Code, nobody's mentioned it here. They've mentioned the LTB and the RTA, but the Human Rights Code is also a dangerous weapon for landlords. A policy guideline created in 2009, I think, by Barbara Hall when she was then the commissioner of the Human Rights Commission. Basically, we're almost at the point in Ontario, where acceptance of a prospective tenant will just be about the next one on the list, like colorblind casting. It'll be no interview, no seeing them, no knowing anything. Is their credit score acceptable? You can't ask them any other questions. And again, I haven't seen landlords yell or scream about that, but it is actually a more dangerous instrument than the RTA is, I think, if it were followed, if it were enforced.
Well, I think originally in 2009, that was and I'm just going to point it out, like that was the beginning of like the sort of the increase of like the rents, and then also like okay, so I was involved in this situation in a legal rooming house in Oshawa where everybody had to go find new houses, and some of the people were paying like $400 a month because they'd just been there for 17 years, and that wasn't really like the issue. The issue was like all this housing has either become illegal or disappeared. Those are the two problems. Like there used to be rooming houses, there used to be basement apartments, there used to be cheap, shitty housing. And I'm just going to say this: if somebody's spending $50,000 on a basement apartment, it's not going to be affordable. They're going to want the highest rent. But it's no longer even possible to rent a place that's like really crappy. Like my first apartment in Parkdale, I had to like fix it myself. It was in a building. Nobody fixed anything to the standard that you see today. So, I mean, I'm not saying that we should go back there, but if you're looking at some of these development fees and some of these costs to go to the city and have a legal basement apartment and do all these things, you can't rent it out for $600 a month. And people who are Ontario Works on ODSP, their amount that they get has not increased. And so it's put this whole population of people in a position where they essentially have to rip the landlord off to survive. And because there's no, like, I mean, guys, think of it. You got $600 a month. You have to survive the entire month and feed yourself and pay your rent. How are you going to do that? It's impossible. But nobody comes out and says, this is impossible. They're like, oh, these people are scamming landlords. So there's like another side of this. Like, what has society done? They haven't made social housing, and none of these people are garnishable. But at the same time as this like split in like the affordability of people being able to pay the rent happened, legislation was brought in to try and force landlords to accept people on ODSP and Ontario Works. And I'm not going to say whether people should accept people on Ontario Works or ODSP or not, but I will tell you this. I did manage 3 buildings, and every single tenant in those 3 buildings over a period, I think, of 5 years that was evicted via the sheriff, okay, that I had to pay the sheriff for, was on OW or ODSP. Now, we did have tenants that were on OW and ODSP who were good tenants. But the worst of the tenants, the people that I had to call the sheriff for, the people that I had to wait to evict months and months and months, were that cohort. So when I looked at the statistics, right? And then I'm like, how did they come up with this information? How did the Human Rights Commission come up with this information that somebody who's making $600 a month can afford a place that's $1,200 a month and won't default on the rent? How did they come up with that information? Because that doesn't make no sense to me. And fundamentally, I would really like things to be different, but at the same time, I still have to protect my clients to a certain extent and not like lose my marbles just because some, do-gooder wants to force me into a situation where it's actually, I don't even know where they got the idea in the first place. And a lot of people need support and they're not getting it. Like, people have this imagination that you can take somebody who has mental illness or who's homeless on the street, may have a drug or alcohol problem, and just like put them in a house and then everything will be fine. But that's not the case. Like, society wants to take care of these people. Like, if we want to solve the homeless problem, we have to both look at the problem and say, like, we can't just put them in a house and leave it on the landlord to deal with this problem that is really a society problem of having compassion for everybody. We can't just put that on one individual. I mean, I'm dealing with a senior citizen right now who were like hired by the city of Toronto, came by and got them to rent to a bunch of people. The guy was punched in the face. His tooth was broken. He's like, the guy's like, run, like, these are situations that happen. Like, his toilet was broken, a giant hole in the toilet. Like, the entire place is trashed, like $30,000 worth of damage. But the lady from, like, when they stopped paying rent, the city lady was just like, oh, well, no problem. Because it's not her problem anymore. They were a problem when they were in her office, right? But now they're in his house. That's not a problem for her because they're housed. That's a success story. But that's not a success story to me. It caused damage to these nice people that don't deserve this kind of thing, that believe the lady from the city who's doing her job, housing, supporting housing. And there's always this assumption that tenants are like not liars, that they're great people and everything is great with them. And even like, I'm saying this, and I'm saying like 99% of people are good, but that 1% will scare the shit out of you. Like, even another time, a guy in one of my buildings who was a complete nut job, went after, like, the lady from the city came to look for bed bugs in his unit, which had no bed bugs. There was no bed bugs in that building. And when she went in there and she says, I can't find any bed bugs, he started like stabbing the bed. And she came to my office and like she was crying and friggin' terrified. And I said to her, like, will you testify? And she's like, no, I can't. So, like, this is the kind of thing where you go, like, it's not order for, like, the world, right? Like, we cannot accept this kind of thing. And yet we are. And so, like, these are, like, big problems. And the answer isn't just to find another small, stupid landlord to put on his lap in his house and have him suffer the loss. This is a societal problem, and we need to have compassion. And yes, people do need houses, but they also need support. once they get there. If they have problems, they need there. If they, can't clean, they need people from the city to support that. You cannot just put this on the landlords. And that, whenever I see city initiatives, that's what I see. And honestly, it makes me really upset because the people who are falling for it are like these new landlords, like brand new landlords, and people like these seniors who believe the people from the city. And at the end of the day, you know what, that guy, he's selling his house. He'll never be a landlord again. The people who let people like in their basement apartment, and they're in there and they trash the place, and there's no support from the city when the rent stops, they're not renting again. One time I had someone call me, and like Ontario Works sent her first month's rent and then said they were sending last month's rent, and the tenant called between paying first and last month's rent and got that money directed back to himself and scammed her for like, I don't know, like 6 months rent at the end of the day. And she didn't know what to do. And then she calls the lady from Ontario Works and she's like, what's up with this? Like, why, like, where's my money? You said you were mailing a check. And the lady's like, oh, the tenant should have paid you by now. He came and picked up the check, but it never got to her. And they will not take responsibility. So the thing is that all of these government organizations also need to step up and say, this is a problem. How can we expect landlords who are, paying their mortgage? I mean, it's not like profit. It's not like the rent or all goes in their pockets. It goes actually on their mortgage, property taxes, utilities, whatever. It's not like, I mean, a lot of places aren't making that. So I mean, I don't know how the city in reality can support that, or the Human Rights Tribunal can support that, or anything, and think this is the answer to social housing problems, is to just put it on these small landlords. And it's not working anymore. And now, like, even I was driving here to my office today, you know what? In Rosedale Valley Road, there's a bunch of tents. And I'm like, is this like what this frigging country is coming to? And that's really the question. So for those social issues, I don't know what the answer is, because right now it's just like, oh, well, scam your landlord, you'll be fine. And that's, to me, is not a viable long-term solution. It's going to create more division between landlords and tenants, and it's going to create more problems overall. That's it. We need to think about these things and how we do them.
Daniel, it's been more than an hour and a half. I think perhaps you should throw it open to some questions if people have any.
So guys, I've been just sort of covering Daniel while he's out in Calgary doing what he does best, meeting people face to face. And I apologize if
it's okay. I was texting actually.
Yeah, but I like the direction this is going in. I think that, landlord, you made amazing comments, and I think this is not only just a specific problem in Toronto with regards to this like growing gap of disparity that's sort of starting to play out. And the question really is, where do things go as things worsen in the market when it comes from the perspective of interest rates rising, rents being capped out, and a lack of enforcement? It starts to sort of raise the question, in my opinion, like at what point do people start maybe taking things in their own hands? Will they take them in their own hands? Is there even value and incentive in wanting to invest in property for the purpose of being a landlord? A lot of questions. So anybody else, if you want to jump in, now would be the time. Let's keep it open. And I love this shit, so let's keep it moving. Who wants to talk? Don't jump in all at once, by the way.
I do have a question for Harry and Landlord Rescue. Like, do you see anything in the LTB changing? Like, now that they have, like, I heard that they put in a certain number of funding in there and they hired more staff. Like, do you actually see any improvements happening?
I saw an announcement today. They put in another 1.4 million today or something.
Do you think it's going to, like, do you see it improving, or is this like a purposeful thing that they're doing just to
there are many reasons the LTB is backlogged. Lots of people unemployed and can't pay rent. Another reason that people don't appreciate is simply the internet. I mean, it has democratized information, so more and more tenants know their rights. Another reason the LTB is backed up is because there are so many defenses and ambiguity in the RTA that cases have become more complicated. Take day one, take 1998, June the 18th, 1998, the first day the LTB started, although it had a different name back then. We had the RTA, and we had no jurisprudence. We had no appeals to the higher courts. We had no other adjudicators' decisions to be persuasive. So you had a hearing, you'd read the act, you'd make a decision. It was quick. Hearings were 10 minutes. Complicated hearings were 20 minutes. Now you have 24 years of jurisprudence, cases from the divisional court, the Court of Appeal, all of which can be argued and which create nuance. All that has created to the doubling of time of the simplest application. And a lot of people don't recognize that. And then, of course, the 5-month closure during COVID created a backlog that they've never been able to. If you take the 5-month backlog from COVID, where they closed from March the 15th to August the 4th or 5th, and you took that away today, they'd be at the regular backlog that they were before. So that's something else that people don't recognize. But will it get better? I don't think so. I think it's going to get worse because the appellate decisions tend to be more careful. And, you know, like there's a decision called King versus Winton that went to divisional court when a tenant basically just forgot to show up at a hearing. And so, you know, you can file a review or an appeal if you weren't able to participate. But it used to be, you know, you had some personal responsibility to show up at a hearing. You know, you diarized it, you showed up. So it went to the LTB, went to a review at the LTB, the tenant's review was denied, the tenant went to divisional court, and the divisional court said, oh, he meant to go. And then the judges, the 3-member panel writing the decision, whoever wrote for the court, wrote something like, you know, we're going to grant the tenant's appeal. Natural justice requires no less. Well, what is this shit? Do they have a sign on the door where they go to the washroom that says natural justice requires no less, and that replaces common sense and thinking? But that's where it's going. Because the LTB adjudicators are bound by what's happening in the higher courts. And that's a problem.
Thank you.
There's another issue with that too, is that a lot of the tenant groups are government funded and are lawyers. And so they can pursue a lot of these reviews that landlords will not, because they make no financial sense whatsoever. And so a lot of the cases that go to review are usually some like brought maybe by ACTO or a community legal clinic or
And
something
appeal,
like.
and the ones that go to appeal very
Yeah,
often.
that's what I'm saying. I'm not talking about like the scammers who appeal and have no basis and it gets quashed and thrown out. I'm talking about like the real cases that end up at appeal are generally either very big property management companies or like funded by community legal clinics or
Or
access to justice or something like this, who have a budget from the government. Now, like recently, I mean, there was a decision that was like extremely inequitable, and we're like, oh well, this should go to review. Review was refused, and then we're like, oh, you have to appeal. Well, it cost 15 grand to appeal, but the damage of the decision was obviously less than $15,000. So the landlord's like, this doesn't make any financial sense to appeal this whatsoever. And then the problem is that decision now sits at the landlord and tenant board as a bit of a precedent. And so we see this over and over again. So over time, the precedent becomes more like kind of tenant friendly, because landlords are just not going to pay like the amount of money that's required to bring an appeal to divisional court on a lot of the matters that get to the landlord and tenant board.
That's a great point. Absolutely.
I mean, I've often thought that landlord groups should, instead of funding this like ill-fated class action against the LTB, should actually like have a legal slush fund to bring highly inequitable decisions that that are against landlords to divisional court, to like kind of like push back against this like kind of like case law overburden that's been created.
Imagine if every landlord, small landlord, paid $10 a year into a fund. And just imagine we didn't have 20 different landlord groups, whether it's FERPO or Solo or Ontario Landlord Watch, but we had one that represent our interests. We could do a lot of damage. But every landlord group protects their own turf. And so we're very splintered.
Eh?
We're very fractured and splintered.
Yeah, and it's like if you do get somebody, they're like, "Oh, we want no pets in apartments." That's our like, it's like you don't even know what's going on. Like, forget pets, man. Like, forget pets.
Yeah, that's not the issue.
Like, I don't know how to explain it, but it's like, and I mean, I think you and I both got kicked out of a landlord group for saying that it doesn't matter what political party's in power. Like landlord groups need to learn from tenants.
Sure, I get kicked out of every landlord group. I got kicked out of Ontario Landlord Watch because I try to be honest. I mean, today, Solo Landlord here posted on Twitter, and Solo's listening to me. I know they are, and they said Harry Fine hates landlords. And that's the type of thing that just keeps us apart.
Yeah, and I don't know if I've said this to you personally, Harry. I think I have. That you have done a lot in your career to
I have tried.
Landlords, and you created an excellent lease package when there was nothing around,
and educational packages, videos that every landlord could purchase.
And you know what? I'll tell you something. Myself still use your lease package to this day and recommend it every chance I get. And
I'll send you the update tonight. Thank you. No charge.
I'm just saying, you know what? There's a lot of people out there. Like, if you don't always agree with everything, like, a landlord says, like, one thing that drives me crazy is like lawyers work for whoever pays them. Now, for most part, landlords pay legal representatives. I'm not a legal representative, but I do know about the bill. I do know about the bill. Landlords pay us, and tenants don't have the funds to pay, and so they don't pay us. So most of the people are working for landlords. And there is this thing like, oh, you should never work for a tenant if you work for a landlord. And I'm like, what the hell kind of crap is that? That's like saying like a divorce lawyer should only work for men and not for women, or women and not for men. And it's really offensive. That I'm just going to say that it's unprofessional and it's offensive. And the other comment that I just heard, which was like a realtor, and it's like a real estate investment network thing, is like, does your property manager own property? You know what? I was managing 400 units, and I did not have my own rental property. I was managing 400 rental units in the first building I worked at, and for reasons that had nothing to do with, mostly to do with the finances that I would like to own. I would have liked to manage or have an apartment building, but didn't have the funds to do it. I didn't really want to have just a house. Anyways, but so like there's like this saying like, oh, you must, have a house. Now, of course, I have a ton of houses, but that's not the point. The point is you don't have to like just work for landlords, just work for tenants, own a house or not own a house. or rent income property or not own income property. There's a lot of very good property managers who do not own their own income property, certainly now, because of like the market. Like, I don't know if people know this, property managers not really paid in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, in my first, like when I was managing 400 units, I was paid $1,600 a month. That wasn't buying anything. So like, this is the kind of situation where these kind of like memes come around and they don't make any sense, and then people just say them over and over again. I want somebody who works for tenants. Not all landlords are right. Landlords have created a lot of their own issues. We wouldn't be having this issue with N12s today if landlords hadn't been giving them like willy-nilly through the years for every single thing. If they hadn't been giving those, like I wrote an article on my blog in 2012 about people who were giving at the time like $700-800 rent increases to tenants in condos, when we were able to increase rent in condos based on whatever we wanted. It was just like brand new properties since 2018, but it was a time from 1994 to 2017 we were able to do that. And I was like saying to people, yes, you can do it, but base it on like actual costs. Like, show your tenant, hey, my maintenance fees went up $50 a month, I want $50 a month. Like, be reasonable, or we're going to get this taken away. And what happened? Well, it got taken away, right? Because people are not, like, landlords are not being reasonable. And that's a problem. And it's kind of encouraged. I called it, like, there was an advent of something called that I called specuvestors. There used to be a class of landlords who was around for like years. Like, they owned buildings, they owned places, they were decent, they weren't trying to scam everybody. And this was like kind of transformed by like this new crowd of people who were just like, let's buy it and flip it, buy it and flip it. I'm going to buy it for 1 year and sell it in 2 years, and make a mint. And that created a lot of problems that we still see today.
Any questions out there or comments? Should we wrap it up? And
yeah, I think unless anybody say something.
I have one question. Sorry, just trying to get on here. It's Shiraz speaking. So Harry, thanks, Mike, Mickey. So Harry, I know you've spoken about the LTB. I think this was part of the topic, right? With the backlogs and whatnot, helping in the LTB. And obviously, you have a lot of experience dealing with them now. Understanding, I think, it was in the Toronto Star when COVID hit and whatnot, and with the backlogs they had before, and increased the part of their operations had changed from a paper-based system to a paperless.
Yeah, it sure has. In two ways. The hearings are virtual, which is one issue, which is really problematic. And they also recently went to an online portal for filing and stuff, which is a mess. But it's the other part that's really the problem.
Okay, so then what? So going virtual, you would think it would get better, right? So what are the challenges you think you're seeing with them going digital? You know what I mean? Having these virtual hearings now.
There's two ways to look at better. First of all, the way virtual hearings work, well, natural justice requires more, because, I mean, let's face it, if people are really sitting in a phone booth in the rain trying to organize papers doing their hearing, or someone that doesn't have computer skills and hasn't been able to, reduce the size of a video file, using some good open source software so that it's small enough to upload to the LTB site. I mean, that's all crap. These video hearings where they're contested and where credibility is the issue and where there are dozens of documents, it's a joke. And I'm a former adjudicator, and I like to think I'm a balanced guy. It's a joke. Did it make it faster? No, because everybody's struggling. Oh, where's that? Oh, I can't find that. The adjudicator says, oh, I never saw the documents. Oh, we never uploaded that. Do you see which page I'm referring to? Like, you can't just hold up the picture. Oh, and then of course you have the whole issue of people are sitting in the same room as a witness coaching them. You know, they can be actually like typing to their screen from their own handheld device. And, you know, on WhatsApp web, they're getting comments from their paralegal or lawyer or friend while they're testifying on Zoom. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Okay, so let's say that the system is one issue going digital. Do you think the other issue? I don't know how you talked about the 1.4 million that they're putting more money into LTB, and you being a former adjudicator yourself, because obviously that's how cases can be heard. You need enough adjudicators, and these adjudicators, I don't know if everybody knows this, but they're on these. They are appointed positions. So these appointed positions only have 1 year to 2 year terms. Right.
Well, a lot of them
So
are long. A lot of them are longer, and you know they have more
yeah.
adjudicators than they've ever had. I mean, like they
Okay.
got like 90 of them, but everything's just such a mess. It doesn't seem to matter.
Okay. All
You know,
right.
there are
So
adjudicators. There are adjudicators still there today that were there when I was. There are adjudicators there who've been there for 20 years. Just a few. Unbelievable.
so that's what I'm trying to aim at is the root cause. Like we're throwing more money at it. I don't know whether throwing more money is going to solve this issue, or like is it a social outcry that this is happening? Because to be honest with you, I with the Ford government being in place, I just don't see it. I agree with you. Like you just look at every other sector, like education, health, right? Like those areas need money as well. We don't
Well, the
know whether
hospitals.
yeah.
Hospitals.
Yeah, that's what I mean by health, right? Like exactly,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
Big
And
problem.
same thing, and same with the education side. Like I know there's talk about international students how they've been treated, how they arrive, but there's other factor of it as well too because they depend on them for revenues, right?
Yeah,
So
Trudeau
that's
depends on immigrants for GDP growth, but they got
yeah,
no place to house them.
yeah. No, absolutely, I agree. And that's the thing, right? Like now it's like I'm not a former, actually. I just to your point, Harry, like you said, it's very tough to sell a tenanted property. I just did that about a month and a half ago, my own investment property. And luckily, my tenants were very, very good. Like they actually helped staged it for me to sell it.
Nice.
I had a very good tenant for 3 years, but due to
Probably
the
because you
interest.
gave them respect. Probably because you were a
Yeah,
decent guy with them.
no, and that's a part of it too. Being a landlord is the customer service side of it, right? Like whenever they called, they needed issues to be fixed. You know what I mean? Like it was a working relationship. And I also have my basement apartment rented out as well too. And the stuff I hear here now is like I'm almost scared now to even rent it. But then at the same
Yeah.
time, I'm treating them appropriately. Like they got below market rent, but like there's no point in me trying to get a market rent or trying to force it upon them. You know what I mean? And like I believe with people renting out basement, they're at a different stage of their life. You know what I mean? Like they're looking to save money. You know what I mean? My assumption is they're working hard to save their money to move on to bigger and better things because they usually are the turnaround is quick. I don't see basement apartments being rented for 5 to 10 years out with the same tenant. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
That's how, and I know this because my father and my uncle growing up, I've seen them do this business, and people scared me when I started doing it in 2019. Like all my friends, like not one person told me it was okay to hold on to my townhome when I bought my new property to rent. Everybody told me to sell it, but I rented it, and no one person said I should be like thinking about renting a basement apartment out. But I had the experience about growing up with my parents, my uncle, my father, and I saw the 90s. I saw the shit show that my dad had to do in this rooming home. And I saw the sheriff come in, had to evict people. But at the same time, I saw the mistakes as well, too. And I learned just by watching what was going on. You know what I mean? And that was one of the reasons why I got into doing it, because I saw the opportunity of doing it. And, and to your point, that's one way of people have been creating their wealth is
Yep.
holding
But you got to give them something in return. I mean, if you're an asshole to your tenants, I'm always amazed. I ask small landlords, have you paid interest on the last month's rent deposit? And they say, oh no, do I have to do that? I said, yeah, you got to do that. And they say, well, I'm not going to do it, or I haven't done it. So you're going to save, $22 a year to start a war with your tenant. You're going to save $22 a year so that one day when you want your son to move into the condo, your tenant can finally say, I'm going to get back at that asshole who ripped me off and thought I was stupid. Landlords treat their tenants like stupid people.
Yeah. Yep.
And when they do that, they deserve what they get.
Well, absolutely, I agree with you, and I can see why you don't give them any remorse. Like, look what happened in this pandemic. It like this point been said, like it's like treated like a small business, and you can see what happened during the pandemic, how small businesses were treated. Like like you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're left out for lunch, right? Literally, right? And this is not any different. Like you have to take the risks if you're going to become a landlord and understand those risks. Right? And you put it right there. If the customer knows more than you as a landlord, then you're in trouble. You know what I mean? Because the internet has provided ample information for tenants to understand what their rights are. It's even to a point where I remember during the start of the pandemic, I was on TikTok and international students were scared that they weren't not working anymore, how they pay their rent. And I think a paralegal came on live and started explaining them all their rights. And then, like, you don't have to, they're like saying, don't get scared of the landlord. Like, if they're trying to force you to pay the rent and you don't have the money, you don't have to. You know what I mean? So the information is, gathering this information is tenfold now, right?
That was a terrible time.
Sorry?
That was a terrible time.
Yeah, absolutely. I get it. But again, we got even, like, very smart tenants, like, who are AAA tenants, who are doing it on purpose, because they figure. I saw somebody here, I think they had posted a picture, and I saw it on their Instagram, and it said that they had great jobs. They were like, their credit score was great, all that, but on purpose they were not paying the rent. Like, they gave the first and last month, I believe, and they just didn't want to pay it. And the question was asked to them why they were doing this, and the thing was, they're saying, well, if I do this for 3 years, I could save a down payment on my home. Because they're taking advantage of the system, right? The LTV is backed up for a year, and that's one of the root causes why this is occurring, right? So, like, it is a scary time, I believe, more so now, like you said, Harry, of becoming an investor and renting out the property. Like, you have to not double check, but triple check everything. You know what I mean?
I wish I could tell people it was going to get better, and I know a lot of people in the industry. I mean, they want to be positive because that's the business they're in, and they want to sell rosy. I get that, but I'm saying what's in my heart.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what rule I have, like, you know what? It may be not everybody's rule, or it's just my rule. Like, if I can't find you on social media, I'm not going to rent it out to you. Like, if I can't find you anywhere on the internet, you know what? That's a red flag for me. I'm just not going to rent it out to you. And that was one of my general rules when I was looking for tenants. Like, I was not going to bend. Doesn't matter if the guy gave me a full year's rent. You know what I mean? Like, it didn't make any sense to me. If I can't find you, something's up. So, anyhow, that's the points I wanted to make. I think the LTB is one of the root causes to what is happening today. I don't know what like you said, they've hired a record number of adjudicators, because that's one of the ways to push these cases through, is to have adjudicators hear these cases. But it sounds more like that the case management system they have going digital is just causing more problems for them, as when before they were paper based, and they still have to work through that.
Surprised me too when Ford was elected. I thought, okay, he's not going to change the legislation because there are more tenants than there are landlords who are voters. But one of the things he can do is he can appoint supporters. He can appoint people with a little more right-wing point of view, because the Liberals were able to appoint their people for 15 years. And I thought we'd get maybe not Attila the Huns, but people who were more balanced in terms of adjudication. I haven't seen that. I have seen more people drinking the tenant Kool-Aid since the Ford appointees. And I don't get it. I don't know if it's the people in his appointments office or in the minister's appointment office, But that shocked me.
I completely agree with that. I mean, like so many times you hear these things where landlords are saying something, like, and I mean, a lot of it is verbal testimony. Landlords are saying something and it's completely discounted, and a tenant will say something and it's taken like the Holy Grail. And it's like, why would this landlord spend like 2,500, 3,000, $5,000 bringing this to court to lie about this tenant? Like, what is the purpose of that? Like, why would they do that? Especially when you get like some of these tenant v tenant social contact things in buildings and stuff like that. It's like, what is the point of somebody? I mean, um, like, what is the point of a landlord? Like, why would we say like, oh, this guy like was charged with attempted murder for trying to stab my super, but because the police didn't show up, even though they were summoned, you're gonna throw me out of court. Like, why would I do such a thing? Like, why would I come here and do that? Like, do you think I hate this guy so much? I don't even know him. It's one guy in my building. So like the like those are the kind of things, like the level of proof that the landlord and tenant board requires for like, it's not criminal court, it's civil court. But
I also find they're very short with people who don't speak the language.
That's true. I've heard that too. I completely agree with that.
And that's true in all courts. And there are so many immigrant landlords. There are so many Chinese landlords, for instance, and their English isn't great. And people mistake poor language for dishonesty or poor language for lack of intelligence. And it's just not right.
Yeah, and the system is terribly bad. There's somebody who owned the house and has had to do some renovations recently just because of some turnovers, and spending a minimum of $75,000 on each of those properties. And, mostly with people with government welfare. I think that the government is not doing enough to listen. I think, as the landlords and property owners, it's probably time to kind of take a different approach. I've heard a few things, a few comments while you guys were talking earlier about associations being in small chunks. I like to see an opportunity for landlords and owners to unify and have a voice, and we can as well take advantage of the media as an opportunity to change the mindset of people towards people who own houses. I think there's a lot of work we can do in that aspect. And also, because if we use the media rightly, the government would definitely listen to us. And this will be passing a message across, basically across the people, be it tenants and every other stakeholder, understanding that, a landlord doesn't mean that this person is a millionaire or somebody who's sitting in Miami or something and just picking rents every month. A landlord could be somebody who's just sitting there looking at that property and hoping he could retire off the rents or off the equity in that property. A landlord could be someone who works 9 to 5. It could be a plumber who just got an extra house just to support his source of income, right? We need to change that narrative, and if we go media and in a unified way, I think we'll be able to reach out more. We've seen like with the teachers union or education union doing similar things. We've seen like the nurses union going on radio and communicating, understanding that, I mean, there might be bad landlords out there, but I think that there's more good landlords than bad landlords. Otherwise, the situation would have been worse than it is already. So I just wanted to put this point out there.
Yeah. Hi. Hopefully you can hear me. I just would like to ask, or just speak on the idea that just like in this world, it seems like a perfect storm of like lack of respect for basic things that we regularly do in business, and then it's sort of like these perverse incentives that have been created because of how things have gone with LTV, with all sorts of scenarios where the law works, and with tenants getting more knowledgeable about how the system works. I just think that I don't know what would it take to change this sort of narrative that we see out there on a regular basis. I think when you look at the media has been used a lot to get at these issues with landlords and even tenants. But a lot of times this backfires because it's just like, oh, look, it's just another sob story. So in a way, I think, well, there has to be something to sort of change this tide in some direction. And I don't always think that it's just like throwing money at it or change the legislation. That's obviously part of it, but I do think that this sort of has to like change back somehow to where we did things with a handshake, or a verbal agreement actually meant something.
We're looking for a better time, like it used to be.
Like now everything, it's almost like there's so much disrespect for any sort of basic thing. And then at the same time, okay, you might have made an agreement to shovel the snow, or at least the tenant might have agreed to do that. But then that agreement means nothing. Like there's no teeth in the actual agreement when, there maybe was a time when you could agree with somebody and then they would fess up and say, yeah, I agreed to that, but I didn't do it or something, So I just feel like this sort of environment has created very perverse incentives to do bad stuff. And to counteract this, it's like there has to be a bit of like overcompensation maybe, or there has to be maybe an educational aspect. It has to be.
We like to think sometimes the pendulum will swing back in the other direction, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, it always, like all things change, of course, and sometimes it has nothing to do with what we're doing, but all things will change. I choose to have a positive outlook towards it, but I wonder sometimes because it seems on so many levels there's so much rotten in the way things are being done. And this anyway, the case management system also was switched. Like they literally changed the software at the LTV. So I can't imagine that speeding things up. I imagine
it's slowing things down.
Yeah, and the adjudicators are like, well, how do I use this? How do I do that? They can't even. I was my own hearing actually. The adjudicator was sharing her screen, and then she started sharing that WhatsApp chat session that she was having with other people, and I had to mention it to her.
Jeez.
Your WhatsApp is on this. Like at some point, it's like they're probably just figuring it out right now, and I'm like, why are they doing this right now? When you have such a massive backlog, and you're going to go and change the whole case management system. So some of these things are maybe just basic bad choices.
I think it's going to take. I think it's going to take some government to come in and just sort of scrap the RTA completely and change the way it's being done. Maybe online adjudication, which with sort of less onerous proof required, and sort of make it more mechanical. Like some cities have tried to take parking and traffic court out of courts. I know New York City's done it and turned it into an online process. There will be tremendous pushback by the left against that, but it really needs, the system has to be burned down to the ground before anything will change.
Yeah, for sure.
Makes a lot of sense.
For sure. And the backlog, I think it's going to continue with the hiking interest rate and the desperation and tension right now, both in the rental market and people who are trying to buy homes. There's going to be a lot more backlog. There's been, you go into any of those landlords group, you see constantly every day people talking about mixed rent 6 months back, 7 months back, and that just piles on. But again, it all boils down to having the government listen to the plea of the landlords and homeowners, because without them listening and even try to do something about it, it's probably going to be a chaos going forward. And when that time comes, they probably can give an opportunity for stakeholders to speak. That way, they can advise on how to make things better. I mean, somebody owes you rent for 3 months, and the person can just keep going, not paying, and it's something that needs to be sat on a table or in a meeting to talk about, to adjudicate. It's stealing. Let's. You can just walk into a grocery shop and pick something this month. Next month you come again. They're gonna call the cops on
Sure.
you.
The LTB is the great enabler. They're
Yeah.
encouraging and enabling bad behavior.
Yeah, they're creating an incentive for profit for these people. But I have to say, there, like having said that, I want to say that there is hope because, fundamentally, and I mean, this was kind of why I got involved in this industry from the very beginning, is because, people always need like decent places to stay. And there's always decent people looking for a place to stay. And I mean, like to this very same day, I rent properties. And in my company, there's no, like, we're not realtors. We meet the people face to face. We get to know them a little bit. And we get their application. And then so it's like a multi phase approach so that you know the people that you're dealing with. So the thing is that all of like there's hope for the future because most tenants are good and most landlords are decent, and it's a service that's required because like students and so on aren't going to be buying houses anytime soon, and there's a lot of people that require housing for different reasons, and so there's a business out there for people who are professional and provide decent service and decent treatment for other people and are respectful.
I've
So
heard some people say that one of the best ways to change the RTA is a bifurcation, so there are different rules and processes for the big institutional landlords compared with small landlords, and I think that would be a great idea.
I think if you rent a house I think if you rent a room or a basement apartment in your home, you should have the ability. You shouldn't have to go through the same level of court as like you should just be able to say, I don't get along with this person. They need to leave. I know that's like wrong. And eviction isn't always the worst thing. Like everybody always acts like it's the worst thing, but people do have to move at some point sometimes. And so it's like how we manage that process, And like that was kind of like the whole problem with condos and selling and buying and all of this stuff that goes on with them compared to purpose built rental is the instability of that entire market for renters, right? And but I really think that there's hope because fundamentally the business is sound. Yes, we have problems with the landlord and tenant board. I actually find that the online hearings actually improves, in some cases, access to justice for a lot of people. And I'm going to give an example of that. For instance, if you need a witness for your case, they are not going to come like multiple days in a row while you get adjourned over and over and over again if they have to come to the courthouse. If you're having an online hearing, that's a lot easier to get your witnesses to show up. They show up. If you don't need them that day, you send them on their way and it's done. So, in that way, it's increased some access to justice. I think that for a lot of people, this process is, maybe a little bit easier. It's increased the servers, so like I can watch almost any hearing that I want to watch. um so it's increased like some transparency at the landlord and tenant board. And so like if they could speed up the process, that would be like brilliant. There's a lot of kinks in the software. Do I think like the idea of dragging paper products around in the courts is kind of was kind of a problem for a long time. The fact that they're embracing email is like brilliant. And they've eliminated the fax. So there's been some like well overdue innovations that I think are good. But on like landlords and tenants alike have to be able to get together and agree that the delays are really like hurting everybody. And I think a lot of people, except for like if you have a maintenance issue and you're a tenant, how are you going to get some quick resolution? You won't. And so that's like also unfair for like the tenants also. Like, how do they benefit? Like these people who waited 3 years for their AGI, now they were low income, now they owe $3,000. How are they going to catch up? That's not fair. Like, so there's a lot of things going on, and then we need to like kind of respect that. And then there was a question earlier on today where somebody asked under the space why landlords don't take things more in their own hands, or like are they going to take things uh, in their like should like here's one: should landlords be able to evict anyone with 30 days notice and the RTB transition to applying hefty fines for illegal evictions rather than approving the evictions as they do now? uh, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think that anybody here except for possibly Harry has had to like actually evict a single mom with 2 kids who's now living in her car, but I have. And I can tell you that I don't enjoy that at all, at all, at all. And so I think that there has to be some kind of process where, a landlord can't just say that they're mailing somebody. Like, there's abuses on both sides with that. And that's the reason why everybody goes to a hearing now. But at the same time, like adjudicators tend to have this idea that just because you get an arrears order for $30,000, you can take that to your bank and collect that money. And it's the same as real money. And it's not. Most of the time, it's not collectible. So there has to be like some, like, I don't know how to explain, like, there has to be some, like, more like that delay has to just be gone. Like, we get 1 month security, it should take a month or two to get to the LTB, and that's it. And things are dealt with. This thing of like a year is a joke. It's like a joke, and it's actually dangerous. And I don't know what would change it. I would like to see landlords and tenants get together and say this delay is unconscionable and the government needs to do better. But I think I'll probably be dead before landlords and tenants get together. But really, the delays actually harm everybody. And like I fundamentally dislike throwing people out, like evicting people, and I've had to do it quite a bit in my career. And I'm really like, when I see people like Parkdale Organize tell people who are low income, who are making these $630 a month, tell tenants to not pay their rent, I get so angry. They're like, oh, we have maintenance issues. You know what? Okay, get off your ass, Mr. Lawyer. Stop telling them to hold back their rent and file a maintenance application and go to the board. Because that's the thing. Because a lot of time that money gets spent and the guys end up being evicted because they spent the money that they should have kept for rent. Because let's face it, if you have $630 a month to spend, I mean, you better go to the management office and pay it right away, because you got like 50 bills and some of them ain't getting paid. But if you can stay in your housing, you're protected. So I find like a lot of these things are very offensive, because it really creates this vulnerability in people. I don't know why anybody expects poor people to be like financial planners and expert budgeters. Like, that's ridiculous to me. It's not realistic. So, like, at the very least, they should be encouraged to pay their rent either to the landlord or pay it to the board, or somewhere, not in their pockets, like, with a lot of things to spend. And so I personally was very, very angry about that, because I worked in those buildings, and I know what happens because the people cannot catch up. And then they are thrown out, and the landlord doesn't care because he's like, oh, I could rent it for twice as much. It's beautiful. But who was it caused by? By these people who have no sense of responsibility, encouraging people who are not expert budgeters to withhold their rent without actually providing them with a place to put that rent to keep it safe from lack of budgeting issues. And I mean, I have a lot more money than most of those people, and I still have budget issues, as we all do. So if you can imagine,
yeah, ODSP could maybe expand the pay direct
it was
whatever,
really good,
and
people.
make it so that they hold it in a holding account. With the tenant not being able to budget, they hold the money for the landlord, or maybe pay the landlord directly, and create an environment where the incentive is to find a way forward, to find a way to agree. Like a lot of times I feel like these incentives are built to make us fight. But what if the incentive was to push people in the direction of agreement? And then you have this pay direct arrangement that has worked out, so the landlord gets paid a certain amount of the housing portion of the ODSP, for example. And then you have, it sort of fosters an environment where you kind of know you have to agree, and so the incentives are there. You know what I mean?
Well, I used to manage a building that was right next to Chalk Farm when they first brought out that pay direct initiative. And in the beginning, pay direct was pay direct. You signed up for that. You had a 12-month lease, and they would pay your landlord 12 months. And when you left that place, they would stop paying it, not in the middle. But then, so actually, Chalk Farm took in like a bunch of people who were on ODSP and OW and all that stuff. And, they got royally screwed because like 3 months later, the government's like, oh, yeah, well, we didn't really mean the part where we were going to pay you direct until the end of the lease, or the person actually left. And they wound up with like, I don't know how many defaulting tenants who just decided, oh, well, we're not paying you direct anymore. We want the money for whatever we want it for. And so a lot and I'm telling you right now in this city, I would be shocked if you can find one building that, like, well, I know there's a few buildings, but most of the buildings, none of the REITs, none of the serious landlords accept people on OW and ODSP. They just don't. That's my understanding, and that's my knowledge. So,
as a landlord, I would never, ever do it again, ever. But that's just me.
You did it again, right? Like that's what I'm
never,
saying.
No, never. Like never. Like my tenant is a straight up monster, and he's on ODSP, and it's been hell. It's been a nightmare for me. But never, ever, while I breathe, will I ever rent to a person on ODSP.
and landlords are traumatized. Like that's the other thing that happens. Like there's legitimate trauma, especially if you live in the same house. Like people like don't understand it. They act like the tenant is the only one who can be traumatized by a bad landlord. But that's not the facts. I mean, you can also be terrified by some very scary people. And I mean, there are some that are very scary. I mean, so as like both sides, we need to address that and be able to speak honestly. Like I'm not talking about the vast majority of honest people. And as I was saying, the good news, there's another good news, and every realtor here, which there's hardly probably anybody left at this point, but one thing everybody needs to know is about Canley. Because in the past, one of the ways the landlord and tenant board was protecting scammer tenants who were serially moving in and scamming landlords was by not publishing their names. So it was like the only court like in the land that didn't publish names of the people, landlords or tenants, on their orders. And now that has stopped. So if you go to Canley, it's spelled CANLII.org, I think. It's spelled. You can go there and you have potential tenants. You search their name in the search bar and you look there and see if they have previous judgments at the Landlord and Tenant Board. Now, the Landlord and Tenant Board is not putting all the judgments on there, but they're putting a slice, like
Also, openroom.ca has a whole bunch of newer orders, so they're posting those
yeah,
too. So
and
you can find
orders.
that. Yeah.
And I myself was party to an application where with Mandy Chappell and Gary Batchelor, who have been charged in the city of Toronto by the Financial Fraud Unit with like 9 cases of landlord fraud, where this lady and like man, this couple who are working full time, okay, like serially scam landlord year after year after year, improving their game, and they were finally charged criminally, and that's actually working its way through the courts as we speak. They were charged with fraud over 10,000 in multiple instances. And I think that people need to differentiate between like somebody who gets behind in their rent, or somebody who loses their job and moves in with their mom, maybe a month's rent, and people who park for as long as they can in nice new condo, maybe making allegations that there's mold behind the toilet or something, taking advantage of the system, abusing the process, and doing it multiple times. Like, at one point, it's not like if you've ripped off a landlord 5 times, like, what is your excuse for that? That's a way of life now. And so that really annoys me. And as much as Harry say landlords should know the business, I've been involved in a lot of things that are like consumer protection, including 2 friggin' Ponzi schemes. And I can tell you that if like a bunch of people are getting ripped off time after time, at some point it becomes fraud, and it's not like some unhappy accident where you lost your job. So
And
that's what I'm going to say about that. So we need to recognize, just as much as the difference between a basement apartment in somebody's home and a building in like a purpose-built building, we need to recognize that these serial scammers have no place being cloaked by the courts, right? Like, they need to say, like, if you go to the Landlord and Tenant Board with like 3 orders, like from previous landlords, they should like recognize that and give you like a quicker eviction and say, like, this person is a serial problem, instead of hiding that information from potential landlords that need that due diligence. Like, you're trying to do your due diligence and you can't do it because the information you need is being hidden by the organization that's supposed to protect you. How's that fair?
Yeah, or maybe even referring it to criminal courts when there's a lot of evidence that these people are serial or professional tenants.
Well,
It seems like it's happening more, but I don't know. Maybe Harry, you can speak to that in terms of the years that you've been doing this stuff. It feels to me like this is happening more often, where there are tenants that serially abuse things.
It is, and the courts and the police are pretty slow to act on it. The police will always simply say it's an LTB matter. If you have them come to your door because you're being abused or because the tenants are doing damage, anybody can go out and swear out a private information with a justice of the peace and hope to lay charges. But often it's fraud, and I know Rochelle's been talking a lot about fraud, and the people who do fraud are more interested in larger frauds. There have been a few convictions. There have been a few people jailed, but they've been really serial bad people, and it takes time. And landlords are busy people. They mostly have other jobs, and I get why they're not doing it.
It's too much. It's too
Yeah.
much work. And for a long time we just couldn't get the information. Even now, if I personally have applied to people that I suspect are serial professional tenants, let's call them, or rent thieves. When I've applied to the Freedom of Information, I haven't gotten any replies back. They will not give me that information, Harry. They just will not. And I've applied probably like 10 times.
Really?
Yeah, no, absolutely not. I filed so many of them, and I just will not get any
I
information.
find even with the police, their FOI people are bad. I had a case where I was evicting a guy from a Bay Street condo because he threw some stuff off the 20th floor through the window of his condo and onto the street on Bay Street through a canopy of a Bank of Montreal that was down below. He was arrested. He was charged. Of course, we went to the LTB as well. I contacted the police and their information people, their privacy officer, and they said they wouldn't give me the information. I had to fight like hell and go to supervisors to get a list of the charges and to get cooperation for officers to attend the hearing, which they did. But I can do that stuff, but the average landlord can't do that.
Oh,
And
absolutely. I get where you're coming from. I mean, it's like, some of these things are like, sometimes landlords should know better, and that's true. But sometimes, like, I've seen some I'd also do some like collection kind of activities. I've seen some very, very sophisticated fraud. Like, I've seen like some very good documents, and people should know, like, a document, there's not a document out there that cannot be frauded. Like, job letters, fraud. Credit reports, fraud. Bank statements, also fraud. So I've seen like all of that. So, like, never really, like, you have to recognize the limitation of like collecting these documents. Look at the person, look to see if it makes sense, double check everything against the information that you have. And for God's sakes, do your own credit checks at the very least. Like,
I was
do
just going
not
to say that.
accept anybody's like any tenant's credit check. No, just don't do it. Do
But
your own.
Rochelle, so many realtors who are acting for the landlord, they simply take the package provided to them by the realtor for the prospective tenant, which has a credit report in, which the realtor for the prospective tenant has gotten from the tenant, and it's simply been photoshopped. I have no respect for any realtor that doesn't do their own credit checks and who they take the 1 month's compensation and they tell the landlord that they've actually, done due diligence. Just shameful.
Yeah, and do not call any numbers on job letters.
No, you
Okay?
got to call the company.
Call the company directly. Track them down, which is very difficult, and to get people on the phone and wait for people to call back, and do like your own checking. Like, I do not care. I don't believe landlords either. Like, if you give, like, honestly, like, if you have the worst tenant in the world living in your place for 10 months and some other poor sucker calls you to get a reference on your tenant to get rid of them, you're going to say yes. Like, I don't even care like who you are. If you're the most honest person in the world and you live in that house with your kids, you're going to be like, yeah, man, this is the best guy in the world, paid his rent full and on time every month. I don't believe any information that I see unless it's sourced independently from like that application. So if they say I work here, I call the company from some other like from the website on there. And even then, like, people, like, these companies provide fake fake employment websites. Okay, like, it is very sophisticated out there, and that's why I say it's not so simple just to say, like, well, grandma should know that, Joe Blow can print off his own credit report that says whatever and a job letter that says whatever, and have his friend on that job letter, and then so on and so forth. Like, grandma doesn't know that. And so I approach, like, and I mean, people might say like you're like paranoid. I like tenants. I like, even after all these years, I like meeting new people. But do I believe a single piece of paper that I get? Absolutely not. Everything has to be checked against an independently verifiable source. That's my rental advice.
What about the idea of teaching new landlords or landlords just getting into it about
Well,
how dangerous this is?
I've been trying that for 10 years. I'm probably the only person who has a comprehensive, accurate, up-to-date series of webinars on every issue, from starting the tenancy to rent control, evictions for every cause. And you try to get a landlord who has a $700,000 house that they're renting out. You try to get them to spend $100 for a webinar, and they balk at it. And just shame on them. I mean, if every prospective landlord, got my Landlord Essentials 3-pack and watched those 3 videos, starting a tenancy, rights and obligation, rent control, and all the accompanying documents and completed forms and templates that I include in it, there would be half the people needing legal help at tens of thousands of dollars than there are today. Because at least they'd know, for better or for worse, honest, and you can tell I'm honest, they would know what you have to do to stay out of trouble. But $100 or $249 for the 3-pack? Ooh, too much.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
I used to have landlord school in my office, but COVID put an end to that.
I
And
remember that, yeah.
back, and that was actually pretty good. But honestly, was it a resounding success? No, because like I would get like 1 or 2 landlords that were in trouble, and they would pay me like, I think, what did I charge? Like $100 or something. I think I charged $100 too. And they would do. But like, if people can just like friggin' call me on the phone and ask me whatever single question they have. I've recommended Harry's lease package like 1,000 times.
That's the thing, I tell people not to get the lease package. People call me who've never been a landlord. They say, I hear you have a lease package. And I say, don't get the lease package.
Why?
Because they're out of their fucking minds to get the lease package when they don't know a thing about the business. I say, for another $149, get the Landlord Essentials 3-pack, which comes with all the forms in the lease package, and learn how to be a landlord. Oh, that sounds like a great idea, they say. And then I see the PayPal coming in for the lease package, for the forms. It's not a lease package, it's a forms package, 30 different forms. They think it's not a business. And they think maybe because they're smarter, they've succeeded in their other endeavors in life, that they'll succeed at that, but they won't.
No.
Maybe they don't realize how serious they should be. Maybe they don't realize how dangerous it is.
Well, they should read the They should read the papers.
But Harry, there's
At some point, you got to take some responsibility. If you don't read the papers and don't watch the news and you don't know anything about the business, at some point, don't you have some responsibility?
Yeah,
well, of course, but we're all human. We make mistakes. Anybody without
if you read the papers every day, you cannot not know how bad it is being a landlord in Ontario. You cannot not know.
But Harry, it's more than that. There's like a whole friggin' industry. Okay, like let's just admit it. A get rich quick passive income industry
that's true.
Been going on for years. Like from Robert Allen, for crying out loud. I've had realtors tell me, like, I don't understand why I would need a property manager in my life. Well,
yeah.
What? You think you can manage a whole building by yourself, dude? Just go try. See what it's like. See what it, And they're like, oh, well, whatever. And it's like, no, like there's some value. Like it's not just like, you're not just a glorified realtor when you run a whole friggin' building. There's other things that you have to know, right? And so
it's your experience they're paying for.
But there's a whole industry of people saying that anybody can be a landlord, that it's super easy, that the road is paved with gold. And like I was on a viral thread a couple years back where they had a real estate and Bitcoin.
Well, I was going to say the same people that are promoting Bitcoin.
Exactly. Like, honestly, like, and it's the same promoters that are promoting these Ponzi
or stocks
and these like shabby, risky mortgages. The same people. They're all promoting this idea that you can make it rich in real estate from what's the other guy? Robert Kiyosaki. He in that stupid book. Like, just buy
Rich
a
Dad,
house
Poor
and rent
Dad.
it out. You'll be like it's not like you don't like listen, there like some people might be fine, but some people like are just like should never own a rental property. Like if you're nervous, if you can't deal with people, if you're like one of these like super detail oriented people who's going to get upset if somebody doesn't follow your every rule, and you think that you can tell how people can live in their own house, I mean, you're going to have a hard time. And I always tell landlords, and people like do not get this. They're like, go with your own social class. Okay? Like if you're like a rich finance dude, buy a house and rent to other rich finance dudes. Like do not under any conditions listen to your realtor and buy a friggin' house in South Oshawa that's got a bunch of rooming house tenants. Like just
Here's
don't do it.
here's who you want to rent to. Write it down. This is your tip, your biggest tip ever. Med students. Write it down. 3 years, bang, they're gone, and you can then raise the rent, and they're the most wonderful tenants because they're working too hard.
I believe that. Yeah, I would rent. I've rented to a lot of doctors actually.
I just want to chime in and say something for 1 second.
Doctors may stay. Doctors may stay, and once they're doctors, they think they're gods. You got to get the med students.
I don't mind. I'll treat them like God. As long as they pay the rent in full and on time, I'm happy.
I'm sorry. Somebody had a question or a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in. I wanted to bring up almost like a philosophical question. So I'm listening to this, and it's all great, and the information's amazing. But at what point does personal responsibility kick in? And this is a problem that I have, because we could sit around and we can blame the promoters and we can blame the products and we can say all this stuff until we're, red in the face. But at the end of the day, at what point does the client, the individual whose money is being invested with their own choices and decisions, at what point do they have to take personal responsibility and action to actually understand what they're getting involved with? That's what I'm wondering.
Well, you know where I stand. I think they're not doing enough.
Well, I think ultimately they're going to have to take responsibility. And like most of us that have to take responsibility for certain things, they're going to yell, cry, and scream about it. So they'll learn the business the hard way or the easy way. But having said that, and I mean, I kind of get from my background with Ponzi schemes as well. So there's like kind of like a level of deception. Like I'm going to say, like a landlord should not have to be a friggin' forensic accountant or a friggin' police, fraud detective to rent a friggin' place, right? So like everybody else, like, yes, it's a personal responsibility. You didn't do due diligence or something like this. I had a perfect application, right? I had a perfect application. The only thing that was wrong with it was that the credit report in the small print said, with this score, and I don't, those of you that have seen these credit reports would remember this. With this score, you will have a hard time qualifying for credit and so on. But do you know what the score was? Was like 700 and change. Right? So the thing is that I don't think it's reasonable when confronted with that level of fraud and that level of document manipulation that you entirely blame the landlord for that situation. Right?
Well, there's more information out there too. Like information is exploding. You get insurance policy and it's like 18 pages of little teeny tiny print. No human being can be perfect all the time. So at some point, the mistakes, even when you make a small misstep, now you're making a little trip that goes into a vast open crack, and you fall 20 feet. Like it's like now just the information overload makes it almost impossible to be as perfect as you want to be. And a lot of landlords are just going to make those mistakes. They're going to be so happy they've rented a place that somebody's interested in, and then they've not taken all of the information in front of them and been assuming that something could be faked or whatever. And then
but a basic thing like not doing a credit check, which I bet half of small landlords don't do.
Yeah,
they take the first person with cash in their hand, with first and last, And of course, that cash came from the money they didn't pay their previous landlord in rent.
Yeah.
I mean, I say it's their problem. They should have to be smarter than that. They should have to do more due diligence than that. I'm not saying they shouldn't lobby and want law reform, but they should recognize at least reality. And reality is you do have to be a forensic scientist. And then you make your choice. I'm going to be a landlord or I'm not. But at least you should know. I mean, why do we want to pretend?
No, you're right. It should be, landlords should know how serious this is and how much risk that they're really taking. And at some point, there should obviously be some basic protections for people that are going to make mistakes, and so that it shouldn't destroy their lives in the process. You know what I mean?
People destroy their lives when they open a restaurant, and most of them will close in 5 years. What's the difference? Why shouldn't these landlords have their lives ruined the same way restaurateurs have their lives ruined? Tell me the difference.
Well, I think the difference is that the restaurateur is not losing their life if one guy buys chicken wings and doesn't pay for it.
No, I mean, they go broke. They go bankrupt.
Well, they go broke, sure, by the mistakes they make, and they move on. But at the end of the day, that's the process of over a year or 2 years or 3 years, where they're maybe mismanaging things. It's not like right from the get-go they have somebody that's out to get them, and they have zero protection. You know what I mean?
If you're gonna do no due diligence, you're not going to open your eyes and see what you're getting into here.
Oh, I don't defend the fact that no due diligence. That's not the case. I just think that there should be some basic protections for the fact that a landlord is a human being. You know what I mean? Like
sure. I mean, everybody on this Twitter space agrees that the system should be different, but it's not. And I don't know. I haven't heard one person here who says they believe it's going to get better in the near term. So
I don't think so.
We can deal with the way it is, or we can deal with the way we'd like it to be.
Right. There's no delusion of how this, living in a world where we'd like it to be. The reality is I just think that a lot of landlords, especially people getting into this mindset of, I'm going to make investment, passive income, all of this sort of Ponzi scheme, this kind of stuff, they should be, schooled in the reality of how serious that is, and how much risk is involved, and how they should be doing more due diligence. Nobody is perfect, but if they understood, like if you're about to get a motorcycle and ride a motorcycle, the minute you get in front of a bike, immediately that this is serious stuff, because falling off a bike hurts, right? I can tell you from experience. So at the end of the day, it's almost like landlords need to, be schooled immediately. Whoa, this is serious stuff. If you fall off and do the wrong thing, it could be really, really bad. So, take it more seriously.
But who's going to tell them that?
More.
The government's not going to tell them that because it's their system.
I wonder, maybe, who? That's a good question. Who is going to tell them that?
It's not in the government's best interest to scare away landlords. No, although that's what they're doing.
And realtors aren't going to give up their commission to do it either. I can tell you that, because
agreed.
They're
so it just comes back to incentives. Why all these perverse incentives? To make it so so rough.
New landlords got burned, right? Like they got burned all the time, but it didn't take 10 months to get rid of a bad tenant. Like
right.
That's the major difference, right? Is that really the consequences for making a mistake now with a tenant are so much greater than they used to be. And
for rent especially.
Yeah, for rent, right? Like it like in the past, like 2 years, like I never used to see, for example, rent arrears get to the point where they should go to divisional court, right? Which I've seen like a number of times, and I've never had it happen in all the years previous that it was quicker for the landlord to go to friggin' divisional court than to go to the landlord tenant board. And that has happened a number of times this year. And that is like friggin' ridiculous. Like even there was that crazy guy in who I don't know. I think a lot of people might have seen it. He was in
Yeah,
the
who rented the 19 houses?
Yes, and he split them up and everything. And, like he was actually at the landlord and tenant board. One of the landlords went there because the guy tried to chase him with a friggin' screwdriver. And it went to the front of the adjudicator. And the guy's like, well, I don't think he really meant to like harm you. And the landlord's like, what the hell are you talking about? I was like in my house seeing what was going on, and this guy chased me out of the house with a screwdriver, and you're telling me that this is not a serious, it wasn't a serious threat to me. This is a true story. Anyways, like 12 of those owners, which were all like being like the fire department got involved because they were all illegal and he'd done all this crazy stuff. And it gets sent over to divisional court. Divisional court gave the guy, I think, 30 days. And then he like sanctioned the guy. And it was like fast, right? Like in what instance is the higher court supposed to be like 10 times faster than the lower court? That I never saw that in all my years of anything. That's it. And it was completely ridiculous. But again, there are good tenants and there are good landlords. And that's like you can't, like, if I've learned anything is that you cannot let, and I deal with shitty people all the time, almost as my full-time job, but there are still good, really good people out there that need housing. And there are actually really good landlords out there that need tenants. And, somehow, this is a business that deserves to go on because those two people need to find each other. And so I feel like there is hope because people will still need houses, landlords will still need to rent houses. And if we can just like make it less painful for any mistakes to get fixed, then everybody can be happier. And obviously,
Mickey, we're going to cut this off at 11.
I mean, we don't
we
necessarily
need
have to.
social housing.
Okay. I know Michelle has her
Yeah,
hand
no, I
up.
wanted to
I don't know
go.
if by
Michelle,
mistake.
go ahead. Sorry for the wait. Go ahead.
Oh, no, thank you so much. And thank you for letting me join. I just joined this randomly because I saw landlord and tenant board backlogs, and I've been subject to that recently, like 2 years, actually, for 2 different cases. And I will say to you, and you won't like this from a tenant perspective, but I have to say, listening to the discourse tonight, I find it a little bit troublesome because I've come to hear from the UK where I owned my house outright. And when I got to Canada, was in a position where I needed to rent for a while because I didn't know where I wanted to be. And I will tell you that since coming to Canada, it has been incredibly demoralizing because the landlords that I have had here have been incredibly exploitative. One landlord was a real estate broker in Dundas who owns 30 houses and who raised my rent illegally by $500 per month. Anyway, she settled out of court. The last landlord I had in Hamilton was just an absolute bloody nightmare. And I have won my first case against him. The other one is under review. I own my own house now, actually, in Simcoe. It took me 7 years since I got here to find a place where I wanted to settle. But I fully accept that there are terrible tenants. I imagine there are. But equally, I think you underestimate the number of landlords in this country who particularly prey on people who are new to this country and who aren't in a position yet to own, and yet who pay quite substantial rents, like $3,000 a month or whatever, right? And so I joined this space because of backlogs, and the backlogs at the LTB are terrible both for landlords and for tenants. And I think that from the discourse that I heard tonight, it seems that you all have terrible experiences with tenants, but I have to tell you that from a tenant perspective, landlords here do not always behave terribly well. And so I just wanted to put that out there. And also, I'm a Bitcoin maximalist. There you have it.
Michelle, have you been here all evening, Michelle, or were you coming in late?
No, I joined, I think, in the last half hour.
Oh, okay. Because some of us, including me, have been terribly critical of landlords and the way they treat tenants with disrespect and treat them like idiots. And so it's not everybody has a lot of people here agree with you.
Well, I thank you for that, because I do think that you know, and I think also too, I just want to put it out there, the banking system here is horrendous. I mean, as a returning Canadian, I got back here after 25 years away. And I'll tell you that I could have bought a house outright, no mortgage, the minute I arrived, but the banks here wouldn't allow me to, right? In order to get a credit card here, as a returning Canadian, CIBC wanted $800,000 in escrow for me to give me a credit card. I ended up going with HSBC that only demanded $100,000, which they still have. And that was to just get a credit card. When I wanted to buy a car here, I ordered a car and I went, and it was a 0% finance deal, for instance. And I went to pick up the car and they said, oh gosh, you're new to Canada. Oh, well, that will be 7% finance. And I said, fuck that.
Jesus.
I'll pay cash. But this is how new arrivals are exploited in this country. And so from a landlord perspective, I would just ask you to consider that a lot of people who come back to Canada or who are new arrivals actually have a lot of money, but we're not allowed to deploy it in the way that we would want to, right? So instead of getting 0% finance on a car, I was hit with 7%, so I paid cash. To get a credit card, I had to give HSBC $100,000, right? And so a lot of your tenants probably actually have money, they're professionals, but we're not allowed to deploy our capital the way we want to. And so therefore, you might think that a lot of your tenants are deadbeats or whatever, but that's not the case. We're just disenfranchised by the Canadian financial system. Anyway, thank you for listening.
Yeah, I've had my own issues with the banks, and I'll agree with you that as a business owner, their reliance on the personal residence as a measure of credit worthiness is like extremely troublesome, and I think a bad strategy. And I know even myself, I applied for a CIBC business bank account, but because I get all my checks at the beginning of the month, they wanted me to either sign up with my personal residence or give them $100,000 GIC, which I declined, and I stayed with TD. So I'm actually quite familiar with that, and so that's true. But when you say to me that some of my tenants are not deadbeats, I can assure you 100% that they are like completely fraudsters. And, you know, yes, some landlords are very bad, and I have seen landlords that are very bad. And I believe you. And I know that you exercised your right and you went to the landlord and tenant board and you got your money back, as you should. That's the proper thing. I don't think that you stopped paying rent and you sat there in the house for like a year. And that's the difference between these different types of things. There is a level of fraud going on that a lot of people are not aware of, and they're looking for brand new landlords to take advantage of. And a lot of
and it's encouraged by the delays at the LTB. It's exacerbated by and encouraged by the LTB delays.
Yeah, and
you would usually, sorry to interrupt, they usually find that among people who just moved to Canada or returned. These are people who are already in the system. They understand how it works. They've rented a couple of times. They've been here. I've had experiences of people who are just moving. I mean, they just want a nice home. They want to have everything working out for them, pay their rents, and move forward from them. I've hardly had an experience with newcomers. I think it's people in the system, like we've mentioned a couple of times here, people who are relying on government support. That's pretty consistent. They're quickly able to corner that money and stop that payment from coming through. You know, people who are already in the system, basically.
Yeah, and I totally get that a lot of tenants play the system. I totally get that. I just feel that from a mainstream media perspective, that the whole narrative is weighted against tenants who don't play the system, who are exploited by landlords, etc., and they have to wait like a ridiculous amount of time to be heard at the LTB as well. So I think both parties, particularly as the economic situation worsens, I think landlords will actually feel the brunt of it because people feel pressured, they have nowhere else to go because of the housing crisis, etc. So I totally get that landlords, many of them are played, if you like, but I just want to look at a lot of good tenants as well are evicted with no reason, are hit with illegal rent increases, etc. It's sort of like it hits both parties, right?
Yeah, I think
Yes,
the landlord as a slumlord is a persistent narrative, and it has been for many decades. And I think there's probably in the market, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in the market there has probably been a shift from larger companies being landlords to smaller landlords in mass. So a lot of this, I think, is creating a shift in the market, but the narrative hasn't changed with it in a way. And so, sure, there are a lot of bad landlords, and there are certainly bad tenants, but I almost think that society hasn't really sort of updated its pejorative ideas.
yeah, and then the percentage of bad landlords are not quite much if you compare that, because I think if the high percentage of bad landlords, then what we're seeing today would be a lot worse than it is because you would see a lot of cries from both sides, either balance ways, or one way or the other. But again, I think the LTV has, they're basically taking as much any mumbo jumbo that comes from anywhere and they want to listen to it, and thereby doing too much. Take for example, like I mentioned before, why should somebody who maybe you had an issue with housing rather than fight out with the LTV, say, oh, my landlord has refused to change my bulb or keep my front yard clean or whatever it is, why don't you file that? And that's something that needs to be heard rather than you withholding rent for a month. What could be the reason for not paying rent for a month or 2 months? Even if they had jacked up your rent, I mean, you could insist paying the same amount of rent and go fight it out at ATB. What would be the purpose of missing rent for like 3 months? And whereby, a small landlord, we have to come up with that cost. And why should that even be listened to? There should be laws that says, hey, if you decide not to pay rent for 2 months and you don't even have a case with LTB for any issues, then the cops should come get you out. This becomes a criminal case because you're stealing, right? And people are not taking advantage of that with the wait time stretching up to 12 months now. People just decide not to pay rent and, not imagine the financial impact on the other end.
The landlord tenant board can only order remedies of $35,000, and particularly with the 5 months closure during COVID, I've seen cases. I've seen one that was my client, and she was owed $100,000 by the time the tenant was finally evicted. And of course, 65,000 of that, or 65,000, was unrecoverable. I'm not sure if the other 35,000 ever got recovered, but it puts the landlord in a terrible situation. The one I talked about earlier, where the tenant on the Bay Street condo threw things out the window 20 floors down onto Bay Street. Between the damage to her condo, my client's condo, and the damage to the common elements of the condo corporation, there is about $90,000 in damage. And again, most of that, if not all of it, will be unrecoverable. So, I mean, these delays, I remember back in '98 when the cases came out of the county court system where it used to be, and the government at the time unveiled the Landlord Tenant Board, which was then called the Rental Housing Tribunal, and it was going to be faster, more accessible, cheaper. They hailed the taking it out of the courts as a great day for landlords and tenants, and has turned into an utter disaster where it's more expensive, slower, and less accessible than going to Superior Court. It's to say that the LTB is a train wreck is not really being fair to train wrecks, because it is that bad.
Yeah, and I was listening to a hearing the other day, and and the tenant, agreed to punching holes in the walls because the other tenants on the other unit were punching the walls too, and the face of the landlords were just sad, but the judge never, the adjudicator never did as if he noticed that. I'm like, how could somebody punch in somebody's hat and money, and you're here agreeing to doing that, and your excuse is because the other person is, and now they filed for eviction, and he's arguing that the house is a shitty property, is a slumlord, there's mold in this, and the adjudicator asks, do you want to move out because this is what they're filing for? And he says he want to stay. I understand from the tenant's part, he might be thinking of, if I move out from here, I might not be able to get affordable or this much rent, any house renting for this amount. But on the other side, you're causing more damage. You're not being a good tenant. You're not playing your part to be a good tenant on your side. You're causing more damage to the owners, right? Why don't you file to the LTB and say, hey, the co-tenants or whatever, they're making, this place inhabitable for me, and we can talk about that, but you refuse to now pay your rent and you're damaging the property. Two wrongs don't make a right. These are the cases that should be heard. We shouldn't be listening to why people shouldn't pay the rent or try to make a payment plan. That's not what LTB should be looking at. We should be looking at real cases where people are living in a slum house, or their major damages, and landlord is not taking responsibility, where people are being cheated, or maybe rent hikes or stuff like that. But at least people should understand, what is your role in a contract when you go in and sign a contract with a landlord. There's a business transaction, not because now it's now managed through LTB and everything has to go shitty as we see now.
Well, it's very nice the adjudicator felt that way, except the adjudicator didn't design the LTB or didn't create the RTA and doesn't operate it. I mean, he's living in a dream world, because as most people know who've been to the board, the adjudication is inconsistent. As a paralegal, there's no way to ever advise clients as to what might happen at a hearing, because there's no consistency of decision making. Tenants are given the benefit of the doubt without evidence. And they're granted relief from eviction, doing the most violent things, having guns and drugs, having criminal charges, being gang members with guns and drugs found in the unit. They're given second and third chances, often supported by government money in the form of legal aid, in the form of the Tenant Duty Council program, in the form of the Advocacy Center for Tenants Ontario, or legal aid clinics. Our tax dollars being used to house people that aren't deserving of housing. And it's not a zero-sum game. If they're evicted, somebody else will be in that house, somebody else who wants to be there and maybe will look after the house. The LTB has just become an enabler of bad behavior because it has a reputation that is known to everybody. That, coupled with the reputation of the long wait times, has just made it a joke where tenants who want to take advantage can. And I mean, there's different types of taking advantage. There's those who negotiate $50,000 payments to move out when a house is being sold. And there's those who simply don't pay their rent. And maybe those are different levels of taking advantage of landlords. But it is just so easy now for tenants to take a tough stand, to not negotiate, to not make deals. I mean, incentives determine outcomes. And for a tenant nowadays to make a deal that would have seemed rational 3 years ago, a deal about conduct or a deal about money or repayment, they don't feel they have to do that anymore because there are no consequences. If you don't pay for food, you won't be let back in the store. If you don't pay your car payments, the car will be repossessed. I mean, anything else in life, if you don't pay, you're going to get cut off. But the government's created, because they don't take the problem seriously, it's a societal problem, but they want to stick it on the heads of landlords. And so the government turns a blind eye. Even a conservative government doesn't amend the RTA to make it fairer. And they just let you as landlords and realtors cope with it. And it ain't going to get any better.
Justice, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, on a more positive note, I think that the majority of landlords and tenants have no issues and may never end up in front of the LTB. I do believe that because I know a lot of people that are landlords that have not ended up there. I think that we hear these nightmare stories. I do want to go back to something that Michelle said regarding a realtor that charged her $500 more illegally. I've not, like, that's not the first time I've heard like realtors doing this kind of stuff to tenants, using their power, using paralegals, whatever. Like, there's TikTok videos on this from tenants. So I'm a pretty fair person. Like, I do have a rental property, but I also feel for tenants as well. Like, I'm pretty balanced in that. But realtors doing that, like, I feel like, you know what, if I did that in my field of work, I might have my registration taken away from me because I'm doing something that's kind of abusing my power. That's how my college would see it. So I think that the realtor business is unfortunate. They're not very properly regulated, and they sort of use their power and what they know in the system to take advantage of tenants as well. Like, there's a story of a young girl right now who was told by her realtor, like, she got kind of like a COVID discount rent because, you know, rents were down in downtown. And then now she's told, like, recently, well, you're going to have to pay this much. And her landlord's a realtor. Then her landlord gets like a paralegal to call her and tell her that she has to pay that much. So that's like kind of like an abuse of power there. So that's where I see there is an issue. And I think it's also important to remember that there is a power imbalance between landlords and tenants. Like, there's a power imbalance between people that are homeowners and not homeowners in this country. Like, if you look at net worth, it is two different net worths. And then with newcomers, like, I've been told myself that, you know, you should rent to immigrants because they're not going to take you to RTA. There's also that narrative, and it's because a lot of them don't know the tenant rules. So I do think, like, even like when I observe some people, like when they comment on my Twitter feed, because I'm pretty, like, I would say I skew more pro tenant than pro landlord. Like, I get comments calling me a renter and telling me, oh, you feel bad because you don't own. I've had like a landlord group on Facebook saying that they wanted me banned off their Facebook, that she always talks bad about landlords. Like, some person actually sent me this in a DM. And then they were laughing because they were like, oh, she's like a landlord herself. But it's just weird. So I just feel like there's a lot of problems with, like, even the way people behave online. Like, they call renters peasants. I've had realtors like tell people that, you know, you live in your mother's basement. Have fun living in your mom's basement. There's huge problems in this country with how we treat renters. It's not like that in other countries. Like, in parts of Europe, it's very normal to be a renter. You're not treated like crap just because you're a renter.
There's talk here that, you know, renting can be the new home ownership, that there should be no stigma around being a renter. You read that all the time in the paper, particularly in Toronto, where a big young population, you know, renting can be the same as owning, except that's bullshit, because if you have to move every 2 years because your landlord says he wants to move his son in, then you can't have a life that way. So that's a real problem. Renting is not something that is equivalent to owning. It is not. I'm not sure, Justice, if I agree with you about the power imbalance. I mean, without any intervention, there's a power imbalance. If landlords could just change the lock and throw them out, there'd be a power imbalance. If landlords could raise the rent at will, there would be a power imbalance. But landlords can't do any of those things. And not every tenant is a social housing tenant who doesn't have language literacy and might have some mental health issues. Tenants are paying $6 and $10 and $12 and $15 and $20,000 a month to rent. There's no power imbalance there. And frankly, even for the average tenant in your downtown Toronto condo or in your basement, there are so many protections for tenants through the RTA and the LTB that I would say that the legislation, which is supposed to even out a power imbalance, has done the trick and gone too far. I don't think there's a power imbalance. I know the legislation was there as remedial legislation. It was created to fix an imbalance of power, but it's more than done that. It's more than done that.
I guess I see what you're saying in your perspective, but I do feel like there's...
I'm not sure I would agree with that 100%.
A lot of tenants...
It depends on whether they have access to legal representation, Harry. I mean, how
many landlords do? How many of the small landlords come to the board without legal representation? How many tenants do?
And just to add to that, even as a new tenant, the law makes it required now that you serve them like a new tenant information, that contains everything about their rights, and which is something I pass on to every tenant I have, letting them know their rights, whether you're a newcomer in Canada or, you've been here in the system, giving them that form at the start of the lease just to let them know. And even with whatever form, LTB form you pick up, it's fully explained there. There's phone numbers, people to contact, and even
in multiple languages.
Yeah, and even with the forms, so the standard lease form as well. So there's a lot of communication out there to empower tenants to know their rights and to be able to defend themselves. But I think that when it comes to Ontario and LTB, there's not a lot on the landlord side. I think basically what every landlord wants there, at least the good ones, is just to be able to hear case faster with the LTB. If we can hear cases, within a month, within a week, I mean, that would be awesome, right? And people can hear, important issues faster. They're being adjudicated faster, and we can both go our ways and go about our business. But the backlog is the pain here, and it's constantly increasing. And I don't think there's any chance that we can even get to a stage where we can have 3 months anymore, because with the pandemic and what's going on now with inflation and recession to come, there's going to be a lot of pain. That's going to take like a year or two to recover. And this goes across with not just even the LTB, like most government services, they're all backlogged.
Yeah, that's certainly true. But I don't know. I just think that for a lot of things, I mean, if tenants do things properly, like if you have a problem in your apartment and you do not withhold rent, and you apply to the landlord and tenant board to get your landlord to provide you with pest control or do this or do that. I mean, how is it like just to wait 10 months? So by going through the proper channels, you're really hindering yourself. And then the other like landlords who are trying to have these tenants and are also hurt by the delays. I mean, in a sense, like, yes, the LTB is like, tenant centric or landlord centric, and we can all argue about different parts of that, but the delays hurt everybody. And then the other issue is the lack of accessible housing. And this is housing that has just disappeared. It just does not exist anymore. And that is also a huge issue, which is not being addressed. Nobody wants to provide any type of social housing. And that, I think, is like a problem, and it's going to create even more friction between landlords and tenants over time. And, people, like, landlords are scared. Like, a lot of landlords are terrified. A lot of them get out of the business. And even those who are renting are like completely paranoid. Like, I go over every application with like a fine tooth comb now. I never did that. Like 5 years ago, I would meet the people, I would look at their application. I wasn't looking to see if they did like credit check fraud and all that kind of stuff, and calling employers like HR line in Quebec and all of this kind of stuff. I mean, I didn't have to do that. I could take like some of this stuff I was given at face value. And that's really changed with the technology that's out there and the easy access to these services that provide, fake documents.
Yeah, and just to add to that, like a lot has changed, like you said, and things are changing pretty rapidly. And I don't think that the government is honest about, providing housing. If they're honest about providing housing, thinking of all the social housing they've provided so far in some of the, public housing, some of them are struggling to keep up with maintenance, and they expect landlords or private owners to be able to, provide this housing, stay without rents not being paid, and still be able to keep people and keep up with maintenance and other stuffs like that. I mean, to be honest, if you want to do create housing, I think it's going to be more like a conversation that you have to bring all stakeholders on board to discuss, just as we were talking before, we talked about lots of basements that could probably provide housing. If this was a good way to invest or do business, or if landlording was so interested in Ontario or in Canada, you would find a lot of people opening up their basements for rent. But with what's going on right now, people are, basically shutting down their basements. I, I mean, look, take any city, for example, in Ontario, and think of how many units that you could get out from a basement, even in a small city like maybe London or Kitchener or Waterloo area, and just think back how that has been taken back.
How many are empty right now? And the city often closes down some of these affordable units. And I mean, I had a guy from the city of Newmarket. He has 8-plex, 2 units are non-conforming. The city's after him like crazy. He's like, I'll pay like as much money as I need to make this housing legal, and he can't. I mean, I've seen that so many times. Like, the city gives with, like, they talk, but when it comes to actually creating affordable housing, they don't actually do it. And that, like, it's infuriating. Like, they'll come and audit my building, and they'll show all my tenants like pictograms of like all the possible things that could go wrong, and give me fine and shit for like if things are wrong in the building. And then their own buildings across the street are disgusting slums. And like, it's just like unbelievable to me that they even have the nerve to both oversee the Toronto community housing that has exempted itself from maintenance requirements. Let's be clear. Like, they don't go to the landlord and tenant board for bad maintenance, but every other single private landlord is like has to be subject to these rules and regulations. And I don't think that's really fair. If you're saying this, you do it yourself first, and then we talk about like all the other people who are doing like 10 times better than you. That's my take on the city of Toronto. I mean, City of Mississauga just started a pilot program where all the landlords are required to register their multi-residential buildings and provide access to city building inspectors at any time they want to come and ask their tenants how things are, and they have to provide like a certain level of service or whatever. Do you think Peel Housing has any of those standards? They have like all the housing providers have like thousands of years of thousands billions of dollars of backlog of maintenance in their own portfolio. Instead of wasting their time on private landlords that are 10 times better than them, go work in your own building, like do a drywall repair or two, and maybe kill some bed bugs while you're there, instead of, you know, dealing with landlords that like, in the most part, are just like probably pretty decent housing for people, you know?
All good points,
They're very
guys. I just want to take a minute and open the floor because I know we've been going back and forth for a while. Everybody's still welcome to stay, but if somebody hasn't had a chance to speak and they'd like to, now's the time. Let's just open it up. And if nobody wants to keep this going, we're okay to shut it down. So if anybody wants to talk, now's the time. Nobody?
Hey, I got one comment for Harry. We're talking about earlier about the LTB and the adjudicators, how they increased. Because I'm going back to the backlog issue, right? And you know what's occurring there. And I just did a quick search on my desktop. I don't have it in front of me now, but so don't quote me in the numbers exactly. But in 2018, so this when Ford government came into power, the number of adjudicators actually decreased. I think it was 83 to 62. So I just leave that fact out for you right there. Before even the pandemic hit, you know, and we're facing all this backlog, and there was a backlog of some sort before as well too. But you can just tell by the reduction of adjudicators already on hand back in 2018 that what the Ford government's intention was to LTB. So I'll just leave that to you, Harry, on that point.
I don't think that's accurate. My recollection is there was never 80. There were maybe 50. And in the last year of the Wynne mandate in 2017-18, they didn't do any reappointments. So they dropped terribly in the last year of the Liberal government. When Ford was elected, he continued that. He didn't reappoint when they expired. And none of us could understand it. No. But today they have huge numbers. I think Rochelle, if you look at the Public Appointments Secretariat website and you go to the Landlord Tenant Board, you'll be amazed at the number.
There's a lot of them are part-timers. I don't know how
a lot are part-time or are working in multiple tribunals. So it's tough to actually have the numbers mean much.
Exactly.
But there have been a lot. There's a lot of new ones, loads of new ones. Like I see new names now every week that I never knew before.
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean, like, you know what, the problem is for all the adjudicators that are taking on these things and with the technology level that's required, there's a learning curve. Like, I don't know if you remember, but I don't know how long of training that you got, but I remember like seeing, for example, Mr. Berkowitz, who was appointed, following around Mr. Graham for like almost like half a year before he was allowed to hear.
It takes 6 months before you're really up to speed.
So that happened, and there was like thing, but like now with the Zoom and all of that, and I mean, like the rulings are erratic and make no sense. I had a lady the other day, an adjudicator, not understand how arrears of rent are applied to the month that is owed.
It appears to me they're not doing much training because new people are coming on and they don't seem to understand the law or be familiar with the jurisprudence from the Superior Court. It seems they're just throwing them in, hoping, which is not really the way justice should be done.
It's like creating even more chaos, and then there's technical problems and how many times I've been like around and like the adjudicator has shitty internet and everybody gets adjourned, and or you have a tenant like take over everything, and then like it's like the whole, like all the other hearings get adjourned. I mean, there at some point, like I really hope that they start to figure out how to make things better. And then the other thing is, like, if you have a lot of documents and you have a complex case, which not everything is non-payment of rent, some things take a longer time, like to say like, oh, my matter is going to take 3 hours, and have it like a block that's 3 hours for your matter, instead of like having like, oh, well, yes, you asked for 3 hours, but I put you 1 hour, and now you're going to wait another 2 months.
3 months.
3 months for an adjournment, and I'm seized of the matter, and God help you if I die, you're screwed. So there's a lot of things that go on that are like a little bit annoying, and it's probably like really pedantic. Like, they can improve the system. I don't hate the digital hearings. I feel like it's kind of improved in some ways and made things worse in another. But definitely for people like tenants who have financial issues, they may not have access to great internet or a great computer. So I can see that really kind of is not helpful for them. That part does kind of suck. But for most people, I feel like it's better. You could attend while you're at work or something like this, rather than having to go to Grosvenor, which is like the worst place in the world to attend anywhere, pay $20 for parking, sit there all day in the courtroom only to get your matter adjourned. I don't know.
This is like if you're watching hearings regularly online, you could probably say that there is a lot of inconsistencies, like the a lot of it depending on the mood of the adjudicator, a lot of it sort of depending on where you fall in the slots, a lot of it like depending on how the adjudicator handles like a tenant showing up an hour later, but then in another hearing the adjudicator like basically ends everything because the tenant's not there after 10 minutes. Like, it seems like there's a lot of like inconsistent application of whatever the rules are. So I don't know. And then a lot of orders take forever. What are they doing? Like,
Order
they ruled
production
on
also
something.
takes a long time.
Why does it take 2 months, 3 months to write out an order that's probably just one page? Like, I wonder how do we even know how efficient these guys are? Is there any
A lot of people have waited a year for orders. That is after their hearing takes place. They're still waiting a year later for orders. I'm going to tell you one more horror story, and then it's been 3.5 hours, too much for me. So I'm going to leave you. I'm going to leave you guys and go to bed after this. But I'm going to tell you one quick terrible thing that's been happening. Partly because of the number of new adjudicators. These people don't realize how tough a grind it is. It takes years for matters to get heard. So what's happening in a lot of cases is adjudicators are leaving, and they're leaving after having the hearings done, but before writing the orders. So a paralegal like myself, we call the LTB, or we email the LTB now, and we say, I'm still waiting for the order. I'm still waiting for the order. They don't get back to you. Finally, a year later, you get an email saying the matter at 126 Cherry Street is being reheard because the member's no longer with us and didn't write the order. So the people that waited a year to get a hearing, a year for the order, are now told they have to start from square one because the adjudicators left. I am leaving because it's past my bedtime, and I hope you've all found it interesting. And good night, folks.
Thanks,
Yes,
Harry.
thank you.
Harry, you're the best, buddy. That was amazing. And to everybody that's still here, somehow became a marathon, but I'm looking for more speakers to come on. Dan is supposed to be jumping back at any point now. Kind of left me home alone here with you guys. But yeah, if anybody wants to add in to some of the stuff that's been said or even pivot topics, whatever the case is, let's just keep it going, I suppose, and go from there. So let me know.
I'm going to step out myself. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. Sorry about that. Thanks again. I'm off.
Landlord Rescue, can I ask you a question regarding property management? Like, what is the cost of property management? Because I've always wondered, like, why more
my goodness, there's still a lot of people here.
Like, why landlords don't consider that? Because it seems like
we should have another space, because I'm going home too. I'm still at the office, you guys. And I have a child. Can you believe that? Anyways, and I just want to say something to Justice, because she says a lot of nice things on the landlord and tenant side, and we get along really well. And you know, I do some of these more extreme evictions and dangerous people and all of that kind of stuff that a lot of people will sometimes hear me talk about. But having said that, like, I still love my business. I still love providing housing. I still feel like providing housing is a very valuable service. And sometimes it just makes me like ill to see that there's so many unfortunate people that really don't have like any options like they used to, and that they're kind of falling through the cracks. And honestly, I can't do anything to help them because my job is to protect the landlord and I can't really take any risks. But I really wish I could. And it like actually hurts me to see that like kind of like the gap in the social services, and that there's like our elected representatives spend a lot of time talking about doing good and very little time actually doing good. And I wish like more people would observe the difference between what people talk about and what they actually provide. And I find that really, really sad. And I want like everybody should have a safe and happy home, and that's relatively affordable for them, me, like everybody included. Like everybody enjoys that, everybody needs that stability for their children. And I, if I had like one like magic wand where I could do whatever I wanted, I would like encourage the government to build a whole bunch more purpose built rentals, because that would provide a lot of stabilities that's just not possible in the disjointed space that's condominium corporations and the different condos all owned by different mom and pop landlords. So that's my wish.
Yeah, and I think that supply does play a significant role in keeping things kind of balanced, because that way lots of people have options, right? I've spoken with other landlords, and just like you said, people are always willing to, help people, even people who might be in ODSP or OW or whatever they're going through, or who are trying to build their credit again from right from scratch. But again, the it's a conflict of interest here between, hey, do I do this and get a bad treatment, or being paid back in the wrong way, or do I just go get an A+ tenant or whatever it is? We have this conversation. I have this conversation with other landlords as well, and where we talk about doing things in our community. We actually put in funds into community projects that help housing, like even donate funds to some of those organizations that help to provide housing for those people. But when it gets to providing that housing, at the end of the day, one also treat it like a business. But again, if there's a lots of supply, then there's gonna be rooms to accommodate, people. Just I'm not happy seeing people, living in tents. I was going through a comment some time ago on Facebook where people were saying, "Hey, can people offer this people home?" And a lady on Facebook commented and shared her experience of how she offered a homeless person a home, gave her, told her, gave him a bed to sleep on, and by the time she woke up the next morning, he peed everywhere, made a mess of everything, went to the fridge, took every food there, made a mess. Like it was hard. It was a horrible experience for them. But as a community, as investors or as landlords, we do all have a role to play in this. But I think the environment is so tense, and it doesn't give us that opportunity. We're all kind of in a defensive mode right now, trying to make sure we're looking out for ourselves. Because when we don't get those rents, we're not able to pay the mortgage, and that puts us in a lot of financial distress for people who have families, or who even their maybe their personal homes, their mortgages too may have doubled or increased significantly. So it's kind of a tense environment, and you expect that the government, should play a role in just kind of de-escalating things, and bring be like a third party in this to make things a lot easier. By making actual, tangible commitment to providing housing. I'll be happy if people have houses to live, and people are able to stay off the streets. Everyone would want that, but unfortunately, the government is only there to, play a role, like giving out $500 one-time payment to people to pay rent. I mean, that doesn't solve any problem. We all know that. So I just wanted to put this out there.
Could I speak?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, my name is Kevin Anderson. So a couple of things that came out tonight that I just wanted to kind of highlight. So they talked about somebody talked about the incentive to kind of fight, and that's more prevalent right now than actually trying to get to a solution. And I think for the government, it's really an interest to keep it that way because they're transferring their social housing costs to private landlords. So there's no real incentive for them to fix that right away. And that hurts the middle class because most of the landlords that hurt from that are not the big corporate landlords. They're small independent landlords who are, basing these on setting themselves up for retirement and stuff. So that's very hurtful. And then we have these purpose-built housings that people were talking about. And I work at a company that manages a large amount of property, different types of property. And some of them are these new purpose-built housing that has affordable housing in it. And it's done through a CMHC program and a mortgage, special mortgage rate or something, and a guarantee from the landlord. The problem with it is, it's based off the percentage of the annual income in Toronto. The problem with these units is that their rent is now affordable, but there's no criteria of who you can rent to the affordable unit. So, in reality, what's happening is the people that need the rental unit aren't getting it. And the people who make more money, who have better credit, get that affordable unit. But the government could say they're creating affordable housing. So, I think that's part of the issue, that they're kind of passing off their social housing costs.
It looks like we lost them there.
Guys, I was texting with Mickey. I think we're gonna wrap this up. I missed like several hours. Obviously, I didn't expect this to go very long, but I'm looking forward to checking out the recording. And I would encourage you guys to start another space if you want to keep the dialogue going. I just can't have it going on my phone all night. Have a good one.